The agenda for today, we're going to introduce everyone, and then we'll talk about the format for the meeting and the stakeholder process. We'll be reviewing what the draft guidebook is, and then we'll have a question and answer period on particular sections of the draft guidebook. After that, we'll wrap up and adjourn. The whole point of the stakeholder process is to engage stakeholders, and so throughout this process, if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, feel free to bring those to us. If you can just come down to the microphone and announce who you are and what company you're with, and then bring us your question with that.
Can you remind people to turn off the video if it's accidentally turned on?
Yeah, so I'll cover real quick for the people on the phone. We are doing a simultaneous webinar as well as meeting for people here in the room. So if you're on the webinar, if your camera is on, then everyone else can see your face in the webinar, and it can be distracting. So please turn your camera off unless you'd like everyone to see you. And for everyone here in the room and on the webinar, because we're doing this simultaneously, if there's a question for people in the room, from someone in the room, they'll go ahead and ask their question. I'll go ahead and summarize it so that you can hear it on the webinar. So don't worry on the webinar if you can't completely hear people in the audience asking questions, because we'll summarize that for you. Likewise, for those on the webinar asking questions, we'll read those out to everyone in the room. Quick introductions. As I said, my name is Kevin Quim. I'm with Incline. We're the program administrator for the Adjustable Block Program. From the IPA, we have Anthony Starr and Brian McGranahan to my right, and then Alex Ryan also with Incline to their right. The people on the phone, for the questions that you're going to ask, there's on your screen on the bottom right-hand side, there should be a chat feature. If you haven't found that yet, go ahead and find that and open up that chat box. Keep in mind that anything that you type into the chat box is visible to everyone else who's here, and so we'll be reading your questions off of the chat box. You can feel free to type them in at any time, and as we pause, we'll go to the questions that are there. Keep an ear out. If we have any amplifying information we need from you, we'll be looking to hear from you to give that information to us. The process timeline for the stakeholder process, this draft guidebook was released on Wednesday of this week. The stakeholder meeting is obviously today. Comment period is open as of the date that we released the draft guidebook. Those comments go to comments@illinoisabp.com. That's our dedicated comments email. And the comment period closes on Monday the 10th at 5 o'clock Central Time. For your comments, both here and especially in your written comments, I would ask that you do a couple things for us. This is, I guess, now our fourth or fifth stakeholder process in this and in others that we've done. Keep in mind when you make your comments a little bit about what we were trying to do when we wrote the offending piece of guidebook that you're commenting on, and then how we can achieve that goal perhaps in a different way, or perhaps what it was that was our mistaken assumption that we made when we wrote that piece, or the thing that we didn't write that we should have, what we should have known about that. So what I'm saying is, a lot of times people give comments and they just say, you should change it to why. It's very helpful for us to know the context of why it is that you're making that comment, and also the context of how that works in with what we're trying to achieve with that goal. We're trying to prevent some kind of gaming generally with a lot of the program guidelines, and so keep that in mind. And if your comment says, well, we know you're trying to prevent gaming, but you could do better if you did this, or you have an unintended consequence of doing that, that's very helpful for us when we incorporate those guidelines into the final product, as opposed to just change it to X. It's very difficult for us to make that actionable. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, you can make your comments in any format that you like, and in some ways, though, you'll be more likely to be successful depending on how actionable those comments are. Stakeholder process covers the guidebook only today. The guidebook will also include items that were covered in other stakeholder processes. So we've already done the lottery process, stakeholder process. The lottery guidelines have been released. If you haven't seen those are on the Illinois ABP website. We've already done the approved vendor process. Those guidelines are complete, and the approved vendor process is open. Most of you have probably already done an approved vendor application. The distributed generation consumer protection stakeholder process is complete. We're just finishing coding that into the portal, and so that will be released shortly. The community solar consumer protection was this morning, so that's in progress. And then the contract, keep in mind that in this program, the final product is a contract between the approved vendor and one of the utilities, one of the distribution companies. And so that contract itself is subject to a separate stakeholder process. And so there's a lot of bleed over between what we're talking about today and that contract. So in some cases, I might punt a question off to the contract because it really is going to be covered in the contract, and that's a more appropriate place to make a comment on that. Please limit your questions and comments just to the guidebook, not to things that we've already talked about. We aren't going to be able to relitigate any past items, and if it's something that covers something else, let us know. We will do our best to deal with that offline. You can call us or email us at our customer service line, and we'll be happy to chat with you about that. All the comments that are received will be made public, so keep that in mind when you're making your comments. If you have some proprietary information in your comment, you can give us a redacted version that we'll post and then let us know what's proprietary. Otherwise, anything you give us is going to be posted on the Illinois ABP website. You too can see other people's comments that are posted there. We won't post the comments until all the comments are in, so no need to worry about your comments being read by others and then them commenting and you not getting a chance to comment back. And so that's a hint to say that if the deadline is 5 p.m. on December 10th, then please, if you can get them into us a little bit before 4:59 p.m., that would be helpful. That's up to you, though. We will review and post the comments, and also there'll be a recording of this stakeholder meeting available on the Illinois ABP website after the meeting, and the slides will also be available. So if you have colleagues who weren't here and they'd like to see it, or you just have a question about what we talked about, that will be posted on the website. What is the guidebook? So it's based on the long-term renewable resource procurement plan, which I'll refer to as just the plan from now on, so I don't have to stumble over that long phrase. The plan is very detailed and long, and so the guidebook is meant to do a couple of things. One is it's supposed to be an overall reference for you for the program, so that you can go here and see, you know, what are the adders for a 20 kilowatt to 50 kilowatt system. You can just go right there instead of having to wade through the entire guidebook to find that, but the source from that was the guidebook and it was copied directly over, so that's the same plan. I'm sorry, the plan. There's additional details that were not in the plan, or things that we had to flush out about the plan that are in the guidebook, so there is some amplifying information. There's additional details on the application requirements, and the guidebook in the end will incorporate all the other stakeholder processes. Those will all live in that one guidebook. So this is your one reference book. This does not change anything in the plan. We don't have the capability to say the plan said that you're going to do this, but we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do something else. And so the plan is the ultimate approved plan, and that's what we go off of. The plan also has some very detailed descriptions as to why decisions were made and how decisions were made. And so please reference the plan if you have any detailed questions. If you just have something operational that you need to know, what do I have to do here? What are the data fields that we collect in part one of the application? That's what the guidebook is for, the actual details of completing an application and kind of the guidelines around how applications are done and what qualifies for projects. How are we going to change the guidebook? There's inevitably, this guidebook's not going to survive first contact with the actual users out there, and so you're going to say, hey, even after the final copy is published, the first project that comes across is going to have some little nuance to it that we didn't think about and you didn't think about, and so we have to make a change. If it's a minor change that's just obvious, a typo or something that just wasn't clarified, but there's an obvious answer to that, we will just make the latest version of the guidebook will live on the Illinois ABP website. If there's more substantive changes that we're going to make, we will open those up to a stakeholder process. That will be announced on the Illinois ABP website in advance. And much like the stakeholder process, we'll publish a draft of the changes, we'll solicit comments, and we'll incorporate those comments into the final product. If you haven't already, the Illinois ABP website has a subscription button on the very bottom in the middle where you can put your email address in. If you do that, anytime we make an update, it will be emailed to you. So if you want to know that we're going to make a change at some point in time, we'd recommend that you subscribe to the website to do that. The plan calls for a review of the plan in 2019. And so that will be done as well. And so just keep in mind that if there's a substantive change that you want to make to the plan, which remember, we can't unilaterally change that, then there will be stakeholder processes in 2019 to make those changes for 2020. The guidebook itself is broken up into sections. You can see those there. I won't read through them. Some of those sections, as I said, were already covered in other stakeholder processes. And so we are going to just kind of go section by section through the ones that have not already been covered somewhere else. So we'll start out with system eligibility, and I'll throw some discussion items out there to start with that we would like some feedback from you on, and then we'll take your questions at any time. So shading studies, the requirement in the plan that we get a shading study. There's not a great definition of what a shading study is. It runs the gamut from having to put irradiance meters out in New Jersey to somebody just uses a crayon and just kind of draws a sketch on a piece of paper, and everything in between. And so any thoughts anyone has on what a good definition of a required shading study should be, please let us know, with the idea that what we're trying to accomplish here is ensuring that we don't have systems that are making inaccurate estimates of their SREC production, because the systems are paid in advance of the REC production. And so if you overestimate, then you'll be overpaid, constantly drawing down collateral. It will be a suboptimal situation for you and for the program if that happens. So we want to avoid that by having an accurate shading study done. Capacity factors are the other thing that we kind of flushed out from the plan. So there were some standard capacity factors. We also added use of PV watts and shading certain standards where if there's any kind of shading, the standard capacity factors wouldn't apply, and some talk around custom capacity factors and how we would process that as an administrator. DG co-location, if you have any comments on that, and DC metering is kind of another subject that we haven't fully fleshed out. So I'll go ahead and go to questions online to start with. The first question is, can we please cover the lottery rules on this call too? So the rule at the beginning was that we're just going to cover the guidebook. Anthony had previously indicated that perhaps if we have time at the end, we can do a summary of the lottery rules. So we'll leave that open for now.
But one thing to be clear there is that would be Q&A only. It's not. We're not taking feedback the same way we are in this guidebook.
Yeah.
It's still in draft form.
Thank you, Anthony. That's very important. So Anthony's, for those on the phone, Anthony's comment was that the lottery rules are final, so we're not seeking stakeholder feedback on that, but we'll be happy to answer questions on the final guidebook that came out. The next question is, the final plan clearly states that tracking systems will receive 19.32% and a fixed system will receive 16.42%. The guidebook says only dual axis tracking systems will receive 19.32%. Please confirm that was a mistake, and single axis will receive 19.32%. A NCF of 16% is far too low for a single axis tracking system. So the plan was actually ambiguous on this point. It simply said tracking system, which leaves a lot to interpretation. There's seasonal tracking systems. I don't think a seasonal tracking system should get 19.3%. So if you have comments on what the percentage should be and what the math is behind why a single tracking system and a dual axis tracker would get the same rate, please provide that in detailed comments, and we'll definitely take anybody's advice on that and give us the math. We'll be happy to look at it. The next question is, can we submit the shading report generated from a helioscope? So the helioscope is kind of a gold standard shading study. I believe it's also a proprietary tool that is made by a single company. So yeah, so I don't think we can mandate that a helioscope is the shading study, but a helioscope shading study from the rules as drafted would certainly qualify as a suitable shading study. Got a question in the room?
Sure, this is Kevin Moore. So in that section on capacity factors, you talk about how you can submit to an alternate software platform and they'll be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Can you perhaps put more detail around how that evaluation will be handled?
Let me tell you what we're trying to do there, and then you can let us know if you need to comment on it or not. So what we don't want is for you to say, I have a software system and it says I should get 1,000 SRECs a year for my 10 kilowatt system. and no way for us to verify that even the software system even said that, let alone what the software, what software system it was. So if you're using Joe's SREC estimator software, and that's an industry standard piece of software, and you can provide it to us and say that we put in these parameters, this axis tilt, shading, and whatever, and it spit out 1,000 SRECs, and we can put those same parameters in and it spits out 1,000 for us too. Good to go. We're good to go. If it's something that is that's standard, that'll be it. If it's something that is proprietary and there's no no way that we can know what's actually going on behind the black box and there's no certainty there, then we might ask some more questions, and I think that's kind of why we left that open. So if your company has a proprietary tool, we might ask some questions about what exactly is going on in the proprietary tool in the background if it's only used by your company, because obviously you could build your own proprietary tool that overestimated rec production just for this program.
But it's not, it's going to be that your decision can be made based on the growth, like on the software, not each individual project. Right? I mean, are you going to run this on every project again?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Right. I'm trying to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. If you right, well,
right.
That's what we're getting paid to do. If you provide us XYZ software and you say this is what we're using for our projects, then every project that you send, we're going to run it through XYZ software and make sure that it spits out the same number as you put in.
Much of it for the incremental project in that case.
It's just entering the data in. I mean, it's automatically done with PV watts, whereas here someone will have to manually type it in. But yeah, we will absolutely check every aspect of your project. So, yeah, go ahead.
Question here. Under rec commodity calculations, applicants will be allowed to use either of these numbers down or choose a lower. And the second one is any proposed alternative capacity factor. So our software capacity factor higher than 16.
So it's kind of the question for those who are online was if the standard capacity factor section says you can choose the standard capacity factor or lower, and then the question is if you have a proprietary tool and it shows a higher capacity factor than the standard capacity factor, can we use that? And the answer is yes. So either if PV Watch shows a higher number or your tool that we've accepted shows a higher number, then that's the number that we'll go with. But if you know that your system is never going to generate the standard capacity factor because it's got suboptimal azimuth and tilt or something else, then you don't want to say that you're going to generate 20 when you know you're going to generate 16. You can voluntarily say 16. Okay, it's just a great point. Yep.
We got an online question almost identical. So.
Okay, good. Okay, next question from online. What is the point of DG co-location if we can't transfer RECs? The chance of getting both REC awards for a co-located site is minimal, and the rate will be lower for the co-located sites. How is co-location legitimately achievable without REC portability? So I think to clarify here, co-location means something different from community solar and for for DG. And so for DG, co-location is basically saying we're concerned about someone who has a farm that's got 5 outbuildings and a house, and so instead of putting a 60 kilowatt system on, which has a remuneration rate here, they put 6 10 kilowatt systems on, which has a much higher REC remuneration rate, and really it's the same thing. And so that's what we're trying to address with co-location with DG. Is we're trying to say that if you put a bunch of projects on, then they would just be counted as one project. I'm not sure what the transferring of RECs, you might want to clarify that for us, because there's really no transferring of RECs involved in the plan in any way, so maybe you can clarify that for us. Transferring projects, yeah. So if this is a question about the lottery, then we'll cover that at the end in the lottery section, because the lottery is not covered in this section. A question in the room?
Gene Clay from Energy Equity. Again, on the capacity factors, the third-party tools they need to calculate that. I would assume, at least for the larger size projects, where we a handful of available software that is being submitted by multiple parties. So providing that software, would you expect individual vendors to purchase a license on behalf of guys getting to run those, or will you basically have a license for that?
That's a good point that we hadn't thought of. I guess we'll give us some suggestion on that. I think it's probably foolish to require that everyone provides a license when we already have one, but at the same point, not necessarily fair to the first guy that has to pay and no one else does. So let us know what you think about that. We're not intending to make revenue off of your license fees for that. We just want to actually have a copy of it. So the question for those online was, if we already have a license for a tool and the next person comes along using the same tool, do they also need to purchase a license? So we'll look for your comments on that. Let me go back to the phone and then I'll come back to you. Is the capacity factor based on AC or DC? That's a pretty good question because everything in this program is AC nameplate capacity. So this is unlike what you might be used to in other programs. Everything is based on AC nameplate. So simple answer.
Yep. Dylan, you asked the Quick clarification on each co-location. The one of the plan says basic count system energized after June 1st, 2017. It seems like the guide on all installed capacity. I want to know if that caveat is still there.
So the question is,
basically, if you have an existing system that's energized prior to June 1st, 2017, build a second system.
So the question is, if you have a system, a new system, and there's a pre-2017 contract, the plan addresses that the pre-2017 wouldn't count towards the total capacity of the new one. And what happens if you just have one that's going to participate and one that isn't going to participate? Is that?
Yeah, if you have like a SCT contract or one, a TBI contract.
Yeah, so the way that the plan is, or the guidebook is supposed to be written, and if it's not clear, we'll definitely want to clarify that, is that the only projects that count are the ones that are in the adjustable block program. So if you have a 50 kilowatt system that you decide for whatever reason not enroll in the adjustable block program, you're just going to not get an incentive on it, and then you build a 10 kilowatt system that you do enroll in the adjustable block program, that 10 kilowatt system gets treated as a 10 kilowatt system. If you later go in and say, well, now I want to enroll the 50 kilowatt system, we're going to reduce the incentive that you get for the 50 kilowatt system as if you had put in a 60 kilowatt system. And so you'll get less than you would have for just a straight 50 kilowatt, but that won't happen until the point at which you submit a second application for the same site. Yeah.
Systems outside the program don't exist inside the program.
Yeah.
Might be a simple way.
Yeah. So Anthony summarized it. Systems that aren't in the program don't exist for the purposes of the program.
And a follow-up question for in that case, with that initial 10 kilowatt contract that you add on another, that would stay in place that contract.
Yeah, the question is, in the scenario that I cited, would the first contract be reduced when you built the second system, or just the second contract? So because the first contract is already under contract, it's much easier to adjust what the second one starts out as, and so the second one would just start out at a lower value than if it was just a native 50 kilowatt all on its own. It would start out basically subtracting away the extra money that you got from the fact that that was originally a 10 kilowatt instead of it being a 60 kilowatt. So we tried to put an example in there with the math, but essentially what we're trying to do is say, at the end of the day, you'll get the same as you would if you put a 60 kilowatt in on day one.
So the whole is a 20 kilowatt system at that point. The second contract isn't going to represent the 20 kilowatt system price. It's going to represent the 20 kilowatt system price, netting out also the extra from the first contract. So it would actually be lower than the full transaction together between the two contracts would then be.
So we decided on that just to make the contracting simpler. If there's a better way to do that, there definitely might be a better way. So.
I think especially with the upfront, the full payment under 10 kW system, it's very hard to adjust the prices when it's starting. Yeah. This appears to us at least to be the most pragmatic solution.
So the next question from online is, if an alternative production simulation model is proposed by a company and approved by the IPA, will it be approved for all projects going forward and instead of every separate project? So hopefully we already answered that. The answer is yes. Once we approve your software, that's what we'll use as long as you tell us to use it for your projects going forward. And the next question, again, I think we already addressed, which is can we submit a higher capacity factor if we have a custom tool, if you have a custom tool, or if PV Watts provides a higher number and that's been accepted, then yes, you can go with that higher number than the standard capacity factor. The next question is the minimal shading criteria are overburdensome to document and communicate between engineering and incentive departments. We would like to see the shade study and 90 to 70 degree orientation requirements be sufficient to use the 16% capacity factor. So I'll tell you what the intent is here is there's a very large adverse selection problem with the standard capacity factors in that what we just said is if you have a higher capacity factor than the standard, you can use it. So everybody who has a higher capacity factor than the standard is definitely going to use it. And anybody who has a lower capacity standard than the standard is going to go with the standard. And so as a fleet, we're going to get a bunch of systems that are somewhere between the standard and what their actual production is, which is less. So we're trying to avoid that. The minimal shading criteria was our way to do that. If you have a better way to accomplish that, then we're open to it. But essentially, we want to avoid a system that's got shading 90% of the day of 90% of the panels getting the same capacity factor as a system that's out in full sun. So if there's a way to quantify shading studies such that we can use that to adjust the standard capacity factor, then that would probably be ideal. We're not sure how to do that. So if someone has an idea for how to do that, then let us know. As opposed to just using custom software to do it, which is how most of us do it every day. The next question is the PV Watts in the online portal automatically using 16%, or can we provide a separate PV Watts calculation based on the module soiling with our own engineers' input? We have not decided yet on that particular parameter whether we're going to do that or not. The guidebook is silent on that. So if you have ideas on that, let us know. I think I would say that our concern there would be that if you have some kind of if you're going to put down 5%, we'd want to know why. You'd have to have some compelling reason why. Next question is, to be clear, IPA will need to get access to the alternative production simulation model in order to double check the output for every individual project, and the answer to that is yes. If a contractor is using their own approved shading software to establish estimated annual production, will the portal calculate what the 15-year estimated production is, or will the contractor have to perform calculations on their own, considering system degradation over time and other items to estimate the 15-year production? Our intention is that if we are using your software and it gives us the 15-year production, that's what we would use if it had been approved. And if your model was giving some intermediate output, like the first year output, the way the model would be designed now is that it would just do the standard degradation factor that's in the plan, and it would apply that to that. If you have specifics on that you want to address, please let us know. Back to the multi-use question, the intent of the guideline seems to be to allow for truly different consumers of power to have access to their own SRECs. If those consumers are on the same property, but one is residential and one is commercial, say rented to different people than the residential owners, then it doesn't seem like there should be a considerate consolidation of the submissions into one project, particularly if it's provable through accounts, taxes, meters, insurance, and taxes that the resident and commercial use truly are separate occupants. So again, we'd solicit your comments on this. There's a bunch of different scenarios that we can see. One example might be a farm where you have a resident on a farm and then the farm is a commercial entity. And you might want to say, well, in that case, we should be able to have two separate systems. One is the residential system on the resident and one is the farm. Again, keep in mind with your comments on this, we're trying to prevent people gaming the system by breaking up what's really a big system into a bunch of smaller systems just so that they can get the much higher incentive rate when it didn't really cost them that much more to put that system on board. So to the extent that you can provide us an alternative that prevents that gaming, we're more than happy to consider it. So SREC truth and kilowatt hour production beyond shading is PID and panel degradation rate. This is not in the guidebook. Any concerns since there needs to be some 15-year rec reality or probability to hit capacity factor contracted?
Hey, Dean, how are you?
So
I'm good. I'm good.
Thanks for sharing your conversation with us. We're going to go ahead and try and mute everyone here. Hold on.
No. We're just kind of moving down the path, I guess you'd say.
I see one person unmuted. Ryan?
Okay, I think we've solved that problem, hopefully. Sorry about that. So back to the question, the true kilowatt hour production is beyond shading and degradation rate, and are we concerned about that? So we're absolutely concerned about it. There's a balance between, there's a lot of different factors that can affect long-term production rate that we can know about and not know about. We're trying to get some fairly gross checks to make, just to make sure that we don't have very large deviations, but getting down to the last 2 or 3% is just not achievable with differences in installation rates and whatever else. Just from year to year, the amount of production is there's huge variance in what something's going to produce, even if it has the exact same, the two systems of the exact same type that are a few miles apart. So there's a limit to how exact we can be on this. We're just trying to get systems to be pretty close to their production, so we don't have systems that are 40% below what they said they were going to be, so that we end up with these collateral drawdowns later on in the process, which we all want to avoid. You want to avoid them too. System size, the manual says inverter capacity shall be measured as a max continuous output, but I think you recently said system size is measured by AC nameplate capacity of the inverter. Please clarify. Our intent there is that many inverters are rated at 2 different rates, a max continuous rate and a max instantaneous rate, or a max 60-second rate, or some other maximum rate for a short term. And we just want to clarify that the rate that is the nameplate rate on the inverter is the max continuous rate. In other programs, we've had people argue that point, so we're just trying to make that absolutely clear, even though you would think it would be clear. Regarding the co-location of DG projects language, the total capacity of a DG system enrolled in the adjustable block program at a customer's location will be considered a single system. Does customer's location mean each individual parcel is considered a separate location, and multiple 2 megawatt systems would be feasible so long as they are on separate parcels, regardless of them being contiguous? The answer to that is yes. The contiguous parcel language is all around community solar. So in the context of DG solar, that is not an issue. So you could have adjacent parcels with 2 megawatt systems on them. Make sure my interpretation of that is correct.
Sounds correct.
Yeah. They have to be DG systems primarily.
As long as, yeah, as long as they're DG. Yeah. How are you accounting for the possibility that if every project submits with a higher NCF and thus gets more RECs per contract, it could significantly reduce the amount of projects that could be awarded? Again, we're doing our best to prevent that. That's a massive risk for the program. So if there's anything that keeps me awake as a program administrator at night, it's that someone figures out a way to do this and we don't figure out a way to detect it or stop it. It's going to be very disruptive to the entire program if that happens, both because, as was pointed out, we end up with significantly reduced capacity for everyone else, and then we have drawdowns for the whole 15 years. It's going to be a nightmare. So believe me, we care a lot about this. If there's something we're missing here where you think wholesale people are going to be able to put very high capacity factors in, then by all means, please let us know about that. We would love to hear specifically what that would be.
I would note that in the plan, the ability you may propose a higher capacity, different capacity factor, and subject to review and approval of the program administrator. So again, that's meant to be in it to be pragmatic for legitimate cases why a different capacity factor is legitimate. It's not something that necessarily automatically means there's a blanket guarantee of it for the reasons Kevin just suggested. And quite frankly, our lives would be a lot easier if people use the standard capacity factors.
I'd also note the distinction between the number of RECs that a project can generate based on the capacity factor and the capacity of the size of the project, which is what we use to gauge how quickly the program fills up, right? The blocks and the categories. So the distinction between the size of the project and the number of RECs it actually generates.
Going forward, we will have to take into account. I mean, since the program is subject to budget caps, it could become a factor.
Sure.
And of course, if you say, I mean, if your project does not produce the number of RECs your capacity factor suggests it does, that will, as Kevin pointed out, that will impact you down the road on collateral draw. So it's actually not in your best interest to give unrealistic numbers.
Unless you plan on absconding with in year 4.
We recommend against.
Yeah, which we would absolutely not like. The next question is about why we chose the utility scale definition of qualified person from in section 2.3.2.4 of the plan. What are our thoughts on using the definition in Title 83, Part 468, DG Installer, Section 20 for qualified person? I believe we did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
We previously used, I think the Part 461 definition elsewhere, but I think this is, in the guidebook, I believe we used the Part 468 definition.
our intention was to use the Part 468 definition. So if we failed in that, then please let us know, because that was what we intended to do.
We produced a lot of documents recently, and
Yeah,
we've done our best.
that change might have slipped out and not been done, but that was our intention.
So there's a slight distinction between,
Go ahead.
So there's administrative rules around installers of utility scale solar and installers of DG solar, and they're slightly different language. And it appears that we may have inadvertently used the wrong language in the guidebook. So we
Or
will,
in the plan. The guidebook, I thought you should write the language.
oh, this is referring to the plan. Okay, in the plan, we cite language, I believe, for utility scale, because we're placing a plan where that's done, it's not talking about it's talking more generally about the RPM, not specifically talking about the adjustable block program.
The guidebook, I believe, does use the Part 468 definition though. So,
Okay, someone online saying it doesn't, so in the plan uses 461 because that's, legislative overview. We will double check that if we use the.
Yeah, but to answer your question, so the question for those online is, what's the difference between these two obscure versions of the law that no one else knows except for a few people who can actually quote it from memory? The difference is that mostly in the term install, and so the utility scale one actually had sections of what wasn't considered installation that were specific to utility scale. Like I forget exactly what it said, but it was stuff that you would only do on a utility scale project. And then I think the key difference is that the definition we have in the guidebook says install means to complete the electrical wiring, and then the other definition makes says perform, I believe, instead of complete, which would tend to indicate that only a qualified person could even touch anything there, whereas here it's complete. So, well, this guideline is or the qualified person definition resides in law. Administrative rule, sorry, and so it's not something that we could actually change what's there. That's just what it is.
getting the right section reference.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that we were referring to DG qualified person instead of utility scale, because it's just more relevant to DG.
And again, if that was our intent, if something slipped through the editing process, we will correct it.
And we had someone made another comment that it appears the guidebook has the utility scale, and there's an additional method for qualification in 468. So we'll definitely take a look at that and figure out what we need to do there. I think we're all in violent agreement on that. All right. Any more questions in the room? If not, we'll move to the next topic area. Okay, application process. So a couple things I'll talk about real quick, and then we'll go on to questions. We're going to talk about how the application portal will work and how it'll interact with disclosure forms. I'm going to show you a couple pictures, and then we'll actually go through the application process. So let me run you through real quick kind of what the application looks like. How many of you guys have done our approved vendors? Has anybody done the approved vendor application? Not as many as I thought. So if you've done the approved vendor application, the software, the portal software, is going to look very much like that, very much similar look and feel. It's kind of like doing TurboTax. It asks you a series of questions, you answer the questions, and then it spits out your application at the end. That's the general idea. Depending on what you answer to one question, more boxes will pop up if we need more information, and if you don't need that information, then we won't ask you for it. That's kind of the general idea. The other concept is that we try and take things that are going to be the same in many of your applications and allow you to push a button next to that, and it'll just pre-fill the information. So your information. If you're the owner, you can say use my owner information, and it'll pre-fill all that information so you don't have to type it out every time. The product will definitely launch with a CSV upload feature, which will allow you to upload all the data in a formatted Excel spreadsheet format. So you could do an Excel spreadsheet with 50 systems on it and upload it to the portal, and it will create 50 applications pre-filled with all that information. The one thing that you can't do with a CSV upload is upload files. And so someone will still have to go into the portal and manually click through each application to the file section and upload the necessary files. We, on our other programs we run, we have an API, which we will have with this program as well. We may or may not have that ready by January 15th because of the pressures of doing the stakeholder engagement and getting the actual portal launched, but we definitely will have that. An API is an application program interface, and so if you have a IT department that can connect something like your Salesforce to the system, you would be able to do the whole application upload. So you'd be able to upload your files as well and all the data just by pushing a button, so that should make that a little bit easier. The other thing that's going to happen and that will be there with launch is that for DG, not sure why this is going back and forth. For DG, you have to do a disclosure form for all of your customers. Many of the things you'll notice on that disclosure form are also in common with what you need to provide for part 1 of your application. Every disclosure form that you do will start a part 1 application that will be pre-filled with all that data. And so when you convert that customer, that lead to a sale, you'll just be able to go and complete the application with the things that you did collect on the disclosure form. So hopefully that will reduce the duplication of effort there. The whole point of what our company kind of stands for is reducing the soft costs on your side as much as we possibly can while maintaining all the program rules from the program that we're running. And we're pretty flexible in doing that because this is our software that we write and we can change. So I would encourage anyone who has any suggestions on how to make that software better to let us know, even if it's just changing the name of a field or making an extra drop down or changing a drop down from a free form to a list of options, anything like that that you want to do or you think would be a good idea. You can tell us that forever. You don't have to do that in the stakeholder process. So if you're just doing an application on January 20th and you're like, this is really annoying that this thing happens this way every time, let us know. And we'll put that on the list of things to fix or change if it makes sense. So we're pretty flexible with that. And if there's wholesale features that you want, like APIs that we haven't already committed to doing, then please let us know about that. We won't fix that in a day, but we can definitely put it on our list of things to do, and most of those projects get done. The application process itself is a 2-part process, really kind of 3 with the disclosure form. So you do the disclosure form. When you've converted that to a sale and you're ready to actually enter the program, you will complete an application by project, a part 1 application. That's basically the details on the system, what the system looks like, what the equipment is, how many panels there are, where it's located, who the customer is, all of the data that's necessary for us to generate the contract. You will enter that information and on a per system basis for part 1 applications. When you have enough systems to create a batch, which is 100 kilowatts in size, which could be just one system. If you have, large systems or multiple systems, if they're small, you can select those projects as a batch and submit them. We are not going to review them until you submit them as a batch. Once you submit that batch to us, we are going to review it. We'll get back to you with any information that we need. And when we approve that batch, there's a dashboard that will tell you all of your systems. It's hopefully pretty user-friendly. If it's not, let us know. But the dashboard's sorted by systems that you've put in, you're in progress, you haven't submitted yet, systems that you've submitted but we're still working on, systems that you've submitted and we're working on but we have an issue with them, and then in the right-hand side will be what the issue is, and then systems that we've approved that you can put into a batch. So those are all on your dashboard, and you'll also automatically get an email every time that status changes, or if we need any information from you, that'll come, via email as well. And that whole process is to get to the point that we have that contract. And so once you've got a batch and we've approved at least 75% of the projects in your batch, we submit that contract, draft contract, to both the utility and to ICC. ICC meets every 2 weeks, and I believe that the items need to be on the agenda at least a week before the
We're working through that process.
the meeting. So at some point, basically, there's a 2-week interval of ICC meetings. So that kind of gives you the idea. If you just missed it, then you wait 2 more weeks until the next meeting. That will go in front of the ICC. Once ICC approves the contract, then it will come back and you will have to actually sign the contract with the utility, and they will countersign. And I won't go any more into what the contract is because, as I mentioned earlier, the contract process is subject to its own stakeholder process, but application-wise, that's how that will work. At that point, you're kind of done with us. You're going to go out and build the project. You have 12 months for a DG project or 18 months for a community solar project to actually build the project. When you're done, you'll come back to us and do part 2 of the application. Part 2 is when you're going to provide pictures of the project, interconnection, final interconnection permission to operate from the utility, any kind of changes to the project that are different from what you submitted to us initially. All that data will come to us in part 2. Once you've done part 2, we will review that and ask any questions that we have and approve that. And then at that point, again, we go into the contract sphere because you'll actually be paid by the utilities, because keep in mind, always the contract in the adjustable block program is between the utility and the approved vendor. So we are acting in an advisory role to the utility to provide that information to them for the payment, but you will actually invoice the utility to get paid by them. We are not processing your payments. So, got someone in the room? Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Amy Taylor from Mount Leonard. And so with you and I together a little bit at the break. And so my question has to do with what you were just talking about with the approved, you know, the beginning, the site improvements and one line and everything, material. And then a couple different things is we submit everything in with certain materials, inverters, modules, but there might be some kind of a issue with getting it. Do we need to stick with those materials and just take them to the AC output, or?
Yeah, the question is, if you put in the part 1 application, they're going to use one kind of solar panel, and you end up using a different kind of solar panel. What needs to be done with that? The only concern we really have there is on a consumer protection side, and so the DG document allows you to put 3 different types of panels in that you could use and 3 different kinds of inverters that you could use. Our concern is really not that anything is going to happen with the system production, but that you promise the person that you were going to give them SunPower panels and you give them some no-name brand new Chinese manufactured panels, and that was not what they were expecting to get, and we all know the cost delta between those is massive, and so that the consumer knows that. So if we see a change in panels, for example, we as the application processing team, your application will be probably at least the 10,000th application that a processor will have seen because of the other programs that we've run. So they're not new to these systems. So if they see that you were going to have, you know, one type of panel and you put something in that's very, very similar to that type of panel, that will probably just be approved. If it seems like something happened that's a vast difference, then we'll. Yeah. So those will all be on a case-by-case basis based on the fact that we're actually reviewing everything that you submit to us. So just to hold on one second, because I don't think I told people on the phone. The question was what happens if you switch types of panels and inverters.
Okay, and then the other question is that whatever we submit, it has to be, when we do the final, if it's taken a lot, it has to be within 5% of that outline of the site plan. And I understand the reason in discussing with you that you don't want anything moving those projects. However, I think there's some unintended consequences that this can bring into play. One is, okay, we do a lot out of farming. We're farmers. We understand the farming industry. So when we go out there, there might be 2 projects that can be set on the field. And if the one that's more towards the center of the field gets chosen, it's going to be a huge negative impact to that farmer and pull the machinery around them. So what we're going to try to propose, or not, we will propose, is a solution to that when we set out there, go out there with the utility, and you can see that they were 2 viable projects. I mean, our hope is that we get both of them hit, and we can use that whole farm field, but chances are they might not be. So, that's one piece, and we run into that with in Excel, where we would go out there and do the site A spot, but when the developers came up, they said, well, you know, it actually makes more sense to do it a little bit this way, and we work with farmers and make sure it matches. So it's still the same project, it's just moving in that field a little bit. And I think the same situation would be for people who do a lot of rooftops. They have 4 megawatts on a rooftop, and the one that's in the center or that's far away might get a pick. It's going to have some added cost, and maybe they're just switch it over, and they both provide mechanism behind it, which you just shared with the allocation system.
So the comment was the co-location rules could cause an unintended consequence when you have one project's chosen and one isn't, and you may want to move one of the projects to a more optimal position on the site. So we'll take that as a comment and take your written comments on that. One thing to point out in the DG world is that there's not a co-location allowance in DG that would allow you to put two 2-megawatt projects on a single parcel, and so not necessarily is there really a co-location issue with DG on the large side. Co-location on DG, our concern is actually more on you doing the opposite, which is breaking a system artificially into smaller systems so that you can get a higher compensation rate. So just keep in mind, again, that difference in definition between community solar and DG. But also the guidebook is for both programs, so definitely not a spurious question. Let me do one question online, Dylan, real quick, and then we'll come back to you. Apples to apples while still on the tree, the panel make and model and its related efficiency, PID year 1 degradation and the inverter efficiency, I think the value of the project on a kilowatt hour total CapEx to get to a comparative for CF contracted and production. I think, again, my comment on that would be, if these things are going to cause errors on the order of 5%, then they'll be washed out in all of the other magnitude of uncertainty that surrounds any solar project production over 15 years. If there's a serious issue that's going to cause errors in the 10, 15, 40% range, then try and quantify those for us, and we will definitely take them under consideration. Yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
So most systems are going to have multiple standard disclosure forms like this. They're getting multiple quotes. How is that treated in the portal?
Yeah, so the way that the standard disclosures are done is that either you as the approved vendor do the standard disclosure, or one of your someone that you've given permission to do standard disclosures on your behalf will do that, and so that's now keyed to your account. So that standard disclosure form will be the one that's in your account. You won't see standard disclosure forms that were done for other installers, and so if other approved vendors, sorry. So if they had another standard disclosure done by another approved vendor, that's in that approved vendor's account. And it will just, if you end up doing the project, then that one will just die because it won't go forward.
I guess what if the same group vendor has multiple things?
So the question, sorry that I didn't tell online, the question is if you have multiple disclosures in the same system from the same party, what do you do then? Because you end up with multiple Part 1 applications already started. And the answer is you just complete the Part 1 application that you want to complete. So yeah, if you did a standard disclosure for a 7 kilowatt system and the customer came back and said, actually I want an 8 kilowatt system, and so you do another standard disclosure for an 8 kilowatt system. When you go in, you'll see those two Part 1 applications. Just choose the 8 and then just forget about the other one.
I thought that it was actually the same 7 kilowatt system, just because you're an aggregator, you're working with different dollars. Yeah.
But there'll each be a separate one, so it's up to you to just pick which one you want. Yeah, and we'll probably put a feature in there to allow you to delete ones that you know you're not going to do anymore, so they're not clogging up or at least filter them out. So.
I thought make sure they get rejected.
It'll accommodate that. Next question is, what's the intention of adding a 1.5 DC to AC ratio cap? The Midwest is the best for a high DC to AC ratio for project economics. There's not much production loss by scaling up the DC side, but can save a lot on the AC side costs. So the guideline that they're referring to is that there is a cap of 1.5 on the DC to AC ratio. The reason that that's there is because the program, as I mentioned earlier, is unique in programs in that everything is based on the AC nameplate capacity. So we believe that a 100 kilowatt system with a 100 kilowatt inverter and 300 kilowatts of solar panels behind it is a very different system than a 100 kilowatt system with 100 kilowatts DC behind it. One is going to be producing at 100 kilowatts all day long, and one is only going to be producing that at the top of the day. So all the assumptions were made that we would have some kind of reasonableness when I say reasonableness, I don't necessarily mean commercial reasonableness, but reasonableness in what was modeled on past results in past programs as to what kind of a standard DC to AC ratio was. So we're concerned about individuals gaming the system in order to maximize the amount of SRECs that they're selling while still keeping their AC nameplate at a lower level. We're especially concerned because that effectively turns every 10 kilowatt system into what's really a 16 kilowatt system, because you can load up all kinds of DC nameplate behind that 10 kilowatt AC nameplate inverter and call it good. So we're trying to prevent that gaming. If there's another way to prevent that gaming or account for it in some way, then we're more than happy to hear that, but we're not going to accept someone getting 50% more production out of their 10 kilowatt system and getting 10 kilowatt pricing, 10 kilowatt below pricing. So that was the logic behind that. If 1.5 is the wrong number, let us know too. So other programs we run, 1.5 is where we settled, but it's admittedly a rather arbitrary number. So at some point, 8x is too much, and 1.1 is too little. What's the number in between there we should choose? If you have any basis for why we should choose that, let us know.
I think, just to reiterate something before, if you do suggest other numbers on something like this, provide documentation explanation. Don't just throw out numbers, because then we're just picking numbers.
Yeah, so Anthony's comment is provide us a reasoning documentation or other reason for the numbers. Our reason for this number is because other programs we run use 1.5, and that's been successfully used. This program is different than those programs, though, so if you have a more compelling reason, we're more than happy to hear it. The next question is, how do approved vendors provide proof of brochure delivered to customer as required as a required document upload? So I believe that so now I'm getting confused between Community Solar and DG, whether that was on the disclosure form that they signed, that they got the brochure.
DG has a signature at the bottom
of the brochure.
Oh, the brochure. Sorry, I'm confusing the brochure and the disclosure form.
We're going to hold that question because we should know the answer to it. We know the part of the law that tells us what a qualified person is, but we don't know this. So we'll get back to you with an answer on that. Can you elaborate on the disclosure form pass-off from the installer to the approved vendor? Batching the process, will there be a CSV upload to assign projects to a batch? Could be useful as batches because it could have over 100 systems each. So the pass-off of the disclosure form from the installer to the approved vendor is that the disclosure forms, which will be released shortly, will have the ability for the approved vendor to assign subs, essentially, a role to do disclosure forms. And so if you have a company that you work with as an approved vendor or 5 companies that you work with, you can allow each of them to do disclosure forms, which then roll up into your account. And each of those entities could be granted that permission by multiple approved vendors, and they'll have a drop-down when they do a disclosure. They can decide which of the approved vendors who have approved them as one of their subs to send that disclosure form to. So that's the connection between those two. The batching process is their way to so that you can just say you want a certain number of programs to batch. That's a fair point. So we'll look into that as we design that.
Kevin, I didn't answer for that question.
Okay.
So the disclosure form says do not sign this disclosure form unless you have received and read the brochure because it provides you with important consumer protection information. So signing the disclosure form is acknowledging receipt of that brochure.
That's on the DG side.
That's Community Solar.
Okay. I believe there's similar language.
Yeah. Check the DG and then we'll get back. How long do the utilities have to make payments once you have approved part 2 of the application? That's a subject of the contract stakeholder process, and so we'll address that there. Can you also elaborate more on the timing between approval of the batch to contracting with the utility? The timing on the approval of the batch is a little bit dependent on volume, and so I'm not going to tell you that we'll approve your batch the next day if you submit on January 16th, because we're going to have thousands of applications on January 16th. steady state as the program moves forward. In general, in most of our programs, when we're handling 1,000 to 2,000 applications a month, we're turning those around in a week or 2 weeks at the most if we have a burst of projects. So that will be relatively quick on our end. There is that 2-week ICC process that is there for the Part 1 application. And so that is going to take some time.
There's 7 business days thereafter for contract execution.
You have 7 days to sign the contract after the contract after the ICC approves the contracts.
Also, the ICC, they tend to meet every 2 weeks, but if you look at their calendar over the year, there's always an occasional gap of a little longer.
Yeah.
Holidays, they have to go to NARUC meetings, et cetera. So it's
about 3 times a month. That seems like the
and
rule of
actually
thumb,
sometimes they have more, it's more than 2 times a week. So again, our goal will be to move things through the system and the ICC, they'll have their own review process as well, but there is inherently some time taken by it.
Yeah. It's our intention to make sure that we're not the one that delays you. So we will do everything in our power to make sure that doesn't happen. To the extent you're unhappy with our performance on that, let us and IPA know, and we'll let you know if there's a good reason for it, if we're just being lazy. But
with the caveat, be patient with us at program launch.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. So that's exactly what I was going to say. So Anthony nicely said for me to be patient with us at launch, because there are just going to be a very large number of applications, most likely at launch. Yep.
Hey, my name is Abraham Meyer with Company. Question regarding the customer disclosure form. If your approved vendor is an affiliate of your customer, are they still required?
So the question is, if your approved vendor is an affiliate of the customer, does the customer have to do a disclosure form? And I think that I wrote the language in, oh, well, that was actually the contract. I would say no, but I don't think we explicitly said that. So if you want to put comments there. If the approved vendor is the customer, then I don't think they would have to do it. And if they're an affiliate, it would be very similar. So
we may want to think about this a little bit. It's just trying to think through any unintended consequences, providing an exception there writ large, maybe something that we want to noodle on a little bit. I don't know that we wrote anything that specifically would absolve someone of that requirement based upon that type of relationship.
Yeah, we did not. We said we did write that you don't have to have a signed contract if the approved vendor is the owner and the host. Right. We didn't write anything about the disclosure. So if you can give us some comments on that to make sure that we talk about it.
Yeah, because I think I want to go back and think through the affiliate definition and then just see if there are situations where we still think it would be appropriate if there isn't this sort of broader alignment of interests between the approved vendor and the customer.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just.
Next question online is again about degradation. So all the degradation stuff, just go ahead and send comments in on that. I think we won't discuss that anymore here. Can we please receive the Excel sheet content and format that will be required for us to take advantage of the CSV upload option for batch applications? We will definitely provide that for you. We can't provide that for you until the stakeholder process is done, because we don't know what the fields will be in the application until the stakeholder process is done and we publish the final application. So there's a little bit of time inherent in us being able to provide that information to you. We fully understand that you would like to have this information as early as you can so you can start building your processes around it and get this stuff done. Trust us, we're working furiously to get this stuff done for you, and we're doing our best. As soon as we have it, we will definitely let you know about it. The next question is, can you show us what the portal will look like for creating a customer disclosure form? This happens before part 1 of the batch process, correct? Yes, it does. So actually the picture that I showed you is from the disclosure form portal. So I just switched over to that on the screen here. So these are 2 screenshots from 2 of the pages of the disclosure form. The final disclosure form has not been released, so don't take this as gospel yet, because this is not is coming shortly. But this is what the disclosure form software will look like. So these are 2 pages from it. So you basically enter the data that you need to enter for each one, and There's many tabs for the different sections of the disclosure form. As you know, if you saw the draft disclosure form, there's a number of items that are on that. Next question is, do we have to follow the marketing guidelines for large customers or just for systems below 25 kW for behind-the-meter systems? I want to clarify, and this question came up this morning as well, the marketing guidelines are common to every system in general. So the marketing guidelines say things like you can't lie, or you can't say something's free when it's not free. That applies whether you're selling to someone below 25 kW or above 25 kW, large customer or small. The marketing guidelines, unless there's something that's specific to a small customer in the marketing guidelines, apply to everyone in the program. The requirement for disclosures, there's a disclosure form for a below 25 kW lease, below 25 kW PPA, and below 25 kW owned system. So there's slightly different questions that are asked when you tell us at the beginning of that disclosure form which one you are. We're going to give you slightly different questions based on that. And there's a disclosure form for systems above 25 kW, which is a very abbreviated version of that, which also has to be done. So there's not an exemption from disclosure forms if you're above 25 kW, but you do have your own disclosure form for above 25 kW.
And those are forthcoming. I don't think people have seen that yet, or maybe even be aware.
And that's true. They might not be aware that there was this. So in the original stakeholder process, we did not have that above 25 kW form. That came about as a result of stakeholder feedback saying it's not really the same to sell to a above 25 kW system. There's many different payment methods. It's going to be very problematic to do that. And we took those comments and agreed with them and made a very abbreviated form for systems above 25 kW to disclose the things that we believe need to be disclosed in any case.
Yeah, it stripped out some of the information that was more hand-holding, that would be more appropriate to us to the customer.
So it's substantially smaller than the small customer disclosure form. The next question is, who signs the disclosure form? Will these be created on a system-by-system basis or one per batch? How will this interface with a possible Excel batch application import? Disclosure forms are on a system-by-system basis. At the end of the day, almost everything in this program is being done on a system-by-system basis because it's the only way we can handle the fact that different systems come online at different times and produce different amounts. And so every system has to do a disclosure form for that system. When we're talking about Excel uploads for DG, yeah, sorry. When we're talking about Excel uploads for disclosure forms, that would be to fill in the data for the disclosure form. Another commenter had asked if we could do another CSV in order to just simply say which systems you want to be in a batch. We may or may not do that. If we did that, that would be a very simple CSV file that just said, take application 157, 199, 288, 455, and make them all into a batch. That would be all that CSV file was. So it wouldn't really have anything to do with disclosure forms. The next question is again on the AC to DC ratio of 1.5. If the DC side is the concern, aren't you already capped SREX?
Same person had a later comment saying they're satisfied.
Oh, never mind, sorry.
Save you a minute.
Are projects submitted in batches for part 1 and part 2 or only part 1? So the batch is only for part 1. The part 2 is submitted as your project is complete. Can you please comment on the reasoning behind including the financing structure and installer name fields in part 1 application? Do you foresee a negative consequence if these change between the time of part 1 and part 2? I believe again that those were in part 1 because they were part of the disclosure form, and that was our main concern there.
So if someone was going to do a lease and then change their mind and go to purchase?
Yeah, so I believe that our intention there, and we can go back and talk internally about this, was yes, the financing structure matters. If you did a disclosure form for a customer for a owned system, and then at the end of the day you said, oh yeah, here's a lease system, then you didn't disclose to the customer what they actually ended up getting. So you would need to do a new disclosure form to the customer to show that they realize what they're getting at the end of the day. The installer name, I guess, put your comments on that. I'm not sure them changing between the initial and the final, what the implication of that would be. I guess we'll have to think about that. Let us know if you think there's any.
Put in 3 options, 3 names.
Yeah, one of the things is that you do have 3. You can put 3 names in for the installer name. Is the interconnection approval part of the part 1 of the application? It is for systems above 25 kW. It is not for systems below 25 kW. No, I don't know if it says equal to or greater than or or below, but can projects be installed before receiving part 1 approval, provided they have received utility approval? Yes, they can. Systems, legacy systems are eligible already if they meet the requirements of the law, and you certainly could build a system without having done this. The issue is that you go at risk for a couple of things. There are some things that you cannot rectify. So if you built a system and it was not built by a qualified person, then you can't go undo that and build it with a qualified person. So you go at risk of us not catching something like that in the part 1. The other thing is that you're not necessarily going to get the block or any block if that block fills and we move on to another block, or if that entire segment that you're in fills and we're out of space, you wouldn't get a spot at all. So the part 1 application is really there for your protection, to lock in that particular rate, that particular block, and also have us check your application. What a part 1 application is really doing is saying, if I build what I told you I was going to build, am I guaranteed that that this is a good project? And we're saying that in part 1. We're saying we reviewed your part 1 project. If you do what you said you were going to do, then and we can show that in part 2, then your project is approved. So it's a pre-approval for you. If you want to forego that, then that's your risk.
For the interconnection agreement, it's systems over 25 kW, so an exactly 25 kilowatt system
would not require it. Okay, thanks.
Well, our systems that are already in interest, some questions. First one, will we have to post 5% bond for 30 days?
I don't know why that microphone died. So the first question is a great question. For systems that are already in place, will the 5% bond have to be posted because the system's already built? But there is going to be delay because we'll have to approve the part 1, the ICC will have to approve it, and then the contract will have to be signed, and then you can immediately do part 2 at that point, and there's a delay of a month. So we haven't really internally talked about that. Someone else came up with that question to me yesterday, I think, and it's a great question. So please put that in your comments, and we'll need to think of a way, if we do approve it, a way for you to show us that it's already complete before, so we know that there's no risk of it not being done. So, yeah.
In terms of disclosure form, so get your customer signed disclosure form. I think everyone that works before, your customer, they're doing something to do with their times, if they sign the disclosure form, are we at that point released of all liability as claims?
You can do anything after that. You can murder the customer and we take full responsibility. No. So the question is, is the approved vendor kind of relieved of obligation once the customer signs the disclosure form because they've signed the disclosure form? I think we're not going to assume any liability for you, but our job as the program administrator is to be reasonable arbiters of this. And so if someone has a disclosure form that says, I was going to build a 7 kilowatt system for $10,000 and it was going to do this, and the customer is like, but blah, 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 and it's signed, that's a pretty strong thing on unless they can show that they signed it under duress or it wasn't really their signature, it's a pretty strong thing in your favor that it was going to protect you. Obviously, I can't tell you, it's a case-by-case evaluation. So there is a role that we play as a program administrator as an arbitrator between, if there are issues that cannot be resolved, a mediator, sorry. If there are issues that cannot be resolved between a customer and the installer, that the customer can complain to us, and we will give you a chance to present what your side of the story is, and them a chance to present what their side of the story is. And if it's apparent, like I said, it's not our first rodeo. I've dealt with people who are those kind of customers. It's pretty apparent to us when it was the installer who had issues and when it was just the customer who was a very difficult customer. So I've seen customers that have bounced to 3 different installers, and we've gotten 3 different complaints. And at that point, clearly it's the customer. So yeah. All right. All right, the next question is, will the application portal allow multiple email addresses to access the same group of projects if we upload a CSV file, for example, or will it be similar to the approved vendor process where we can only have one email? The way that the portal is designed is that an approved vendor can only have one login to the approved vendor portal, but you can have multiple people working on the portal at the same time. So you can have multiple people who are working on it, but there's just one login to it. If there's issues where you have a reason why you would need to know who at your company was doing something, it's potentially something we can work on. Let us know if that's, if so, exactly what your workflow issue is that we need to address. And if it's just an issue that you need the emails sent to multiple email addresses at your company, the standard system emails, then we can definitely design the system to allow for that. That's not a big deal at all. You have to provide the brochure to systems over 25 kW. The draft appears to be written to residential homeowners. I believe that the brochure is only for 25 kW and below. We'll get back to that question shortly.
Clarify that point. I don't think it's directly addressed in the plan.
Yeah.
Other issue of the brochure for systems that have been energized after June 1st, or June 1st, 2017, the brochure having to be delivered to the customer to test its delivery, which I don't think necessarily limits it to any of those systems that are below 25 kW size. So we may want to think that through.
All right, we're working on that one. Once a disclosure form is completed, will the Part 1 application automatically be generated for us to complete in our approved vendor portal? And I would say that yes, with the caveat that it won't be ready until January 15th. So if you do disclosure forms, which we'll be able to start doing shortly, those will generate applications, but they won't be visible to you until January 15th. Is the name of the applicant the entity that will be utilized for the purpose of the application of the 20% developer cap if a block category goes to lottery? The lottery, so that's a lottery question, so I'd have to pull out the lottery guidance to say whether that's the owner. Certainly it's not the approved vendor that is the related entity. The language is very carefully written there, so I'd have to pull that up to tell you, but we don't have it in front of us for this particular stakeholder process. What will be the options from which to choose related to the system mounting field?
This is referring to the,
I'm assuming you're talking about ground mount and roof.
if you look up at,
Your
your sample disclosure form.
Yeah, so because it's not live, I can't tell you what the developers put in that box, but I think it's ground mount and roof mount. Shouldn't have left it on this page, I guess. Should we get the permitting done for community solar before Part 1, or can we show any proof that the permitting is in process? Again, that's covered in the lottery procedures, and there's a very carefully, painstakingly written paragraph about that I'm not going to try and freeform here. When does the 5% bond get repaid? That is, so the plan addresses that, and I believe we address it somewhat. I'm not sure. Can I address that, or should we wait?
Sure. I mean, there's a few different options.
Yeah, basically the way that the bond is set up is that it's repaid. So you put the 5% bond down at the time of your Part 1 application. At the time of your Part 2 acceptance, and the payment by the
No,
I'm sorry,
no,
it's 5% bond at the time the contract is signed. I'm sorry. The 5% bond goes when the contract is
You
signed.
have a certain number of days.
You have, I think, 30 days afterwards to put your 5% bond down. At the time the system is completed and you're being paid by the utility, you have the option to exchange that with the last payment, taking that out of the last payment for your system. Understandably, that's just changing.
No, it's when at the end of the contract.
At the end of the contract, right?
Right, with 5% is withheld.
you can opt to have 5% withheld at the end of the contract in exchange for having the 5% that you originally paid back to you. Understanding that that's them taking paying you $1,000 less and then paying you $1,000. But it would be a separate transaction. So if for tax reasons or any other reason you wanted to do that, that's possible. And then the plan also says that your bond will be repaid when the total value of the remaining SRECs to be delivered under the contract falls below the value of the 5% collateral. So that's just directly out of the plan. The mechanics of how that will work are going to come out of the stakeholder process for the contract, and so I won't go into any more details on that. Yeah.
Kevin Gordon, Secretary. So there's a requirement in the part 1 that states that you don't have to reapply as long as you don't adjust your layout below 5%. And there was a similar requirement, by the way, in the lottery section, which we're not discussing, but I strongly encourage you to discuss that. What's the nature of that? Because I think at this point, you're not going to be able to know the exact location of your panel, right? I mean, you haven't gone through your geotech work, you haven't gone into detailed engineering. There could be some utility could require you to move X, Y, and Z. We just don't know at this point. Can you explain the reason for having a 5% limit, and is the agency open to adjusting it either in the second or the last section?
So the question is, can we explain the reasoning behind the 5% limit in changes, and is the agency open to changing that because there might be situations where the reality on the ground causes more than a 5% change, and we don't want to have unintended consequences of that failing out project. So first of all, there's kind of two trains of logic behind the 5% change. One is that we gave 5% so that in this case of, for example, DG systems, you're always going to have, whether it's a 10 kilowatt system or a 100 kilowatt system, you're going to have systems where you put 2 extra panels on, or 2 panels can't go on because there's a ventilation duct or something's just different. So we're trying to give some leeway there for just the general types of changes that always occur when you do a DG installation. So that's kind of one half of it. On the other half of it, we wanted to prevent gaming of the system by people putting in co-located projects on a parcel when they really were kind of given a free call option to, if only one project won, move the remaining project to where they wanted it to go, and that would be co-location with community solar projects, the co-location standard for community solar projects, which allows more than one project on one parcel. So that was the logic behind it, and I'll let IPA speak for their openness to consider.
And I believe Kevin described that in other programs, Incline has administered 5% for DG, has worked well as a.
Right, and that's for kind of the first half. The second half of the anti-gaming, that's I'll let you guys speak to that, or you clarify.
I guess you're saying like 5% is gaming. You're not going to move a solar project 5%.
5%, I believe, applied to the size of the project.
The total surface area covered by the solar array is some sort of way in which you could change the array's output or outlay that it would also be 5%.
Yeah. I mean, and there's the 2 parallel requirements here, right? The guy who runs a lot, so, but moving your panels 5% can easily happen in detail easily. Yeah. Right? And that's not like gaming. That's just engineering.
So I would say that to the extent that there's a reasonable number, so you know what we're trying to prevent, and to the extent that you can give us a reasonable number and some logic behind why you will arrive at that reasonable number, the 5% is again a number that was chosen and doesn't necessarily.
Okay. I mean, it has to be monitored, or would that be a number? Would that be a percentage?
So it needs. I will tell you one thing. That's a great question, because I'd like to say, in one version of this, we said a major change, and then we thought about that, and we're like, well, as the administrator, it's impossible for me to say that was major or not major, and so we need some kind of number so we can quantify what it is. So it can't just be the word minor, as much as we might like that. But if there's another way to quantify it besides 5%, I'm not super happy with the percentage thing either.
Okay.
So.
That's helpful. Yeah. Like, well, then you've got to do what 5%.
Yeah, it's
like, I mean, we've just got a whole series of.
just a way to try and achieve that. So if there's a better way to achieve it, I would be the first to tell you there probably is.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have a question with respect to co-located community solar projects up to 4 megawatts. Back with renewable energy. Just a point of clarification, trying to get to how you guys have arrived at this tackle. For approved vendors intending to apply for 2 megawatts co-located community solar projects on a parcel, is the preference of the IPA that is indicated in the application? Is it intended that those be approved as 1 individual project or 2 individual projects?
So the question is, for community solar co-located projects, 2 projects on the same parcel, will the developer need to indicate that on the application, and will they be considered 1 application or 2 applications? So the answer to the first question is yes, we will have you indicate that, because otherwise it would disqualify you from putting the 2 projects on 1 parcel, because you're only allowed to have 2 megawatts on a parcel. So you're depending on an exemption from the general rule of 2 megawatts per parcel. So we would ask you that and check that. We'll also be asking you if the parcel's been subdivided within the certain number of years, because that's a requirement for that particular rule. And it will be treated as 2 applications, because each project is its own project. It needs to have a separate interconnection, it needs to be a separate project. So each project is separate.
So for purposes, this goes back to the lottery, but I think it applies to the application process as well. So they're essentially seen as 2 different projects and will be treated as essentially 2 entries.
Yes.
Got it. And then on a separate note, with respect to development timelines for community solar projects, there is 18 months allotted. Usually with intended with a comparable payment. Is the IPA considering in their draft contract a provision whereby approved vendors are granted a day-to-day extension for documented utility delays, as recently approved in their most recent utility scale procurement contract?
So the question there is, in addition to the delays that are in the plan, does the IPA have any plans to allow for delays, 1-for-1 delays that are caused by the utility? And there's kind of 2 different areas of that. I think we addressed that will be to your satisfaction. So in the plan there, if there's delays for interconnection, if your system is electrically ready to go, but there's an interconnection delay, you get an infinite delay for that is allowed. And then we also wrote in the draft guidebook that if there's delays on, and I forget the exact language that you used, Brian drafted this, but essentially, if your system is being held up because the utility has a long backlog, because we know there's all these projects that are going right at once, and the utility has a long backlog of interconnection studies they have to do, so you couldn't even get started on your project for 6 months because the utility didn't get a final cost estimate to you, then you can request that you get a delay of that time period.
The idea was just that's a good call.
Yeah, we have a good cause.
Yeah. So there's there's basically a ability. I guess this isn't a contract. I shouldn't be saying this. Sorry.
Yeah.
We completely see where you're coming from, and it's definitely being considered. How about that?
Tim Wells, we have a single user that uses about 2 million kilowatt hours annually, and they have the capacity for about 8 megawatts on the roof. But most utility scale programs, the solar programs, define the fact that they can only use a max of 40% of a project. They can't be a single user more than 40% of the output. And DG, the max is 2 megawatts. So what really is their option as a single user?
Yeah, I mean, their option is to put a 2 megawatt project on and buy the rest of their electricity. There's nothing that precludes someone from being a purchaser from multiple community solar projects. So that's definitely an option for them as well. There's nothing that precludes them from putting a DG project on for 2.
That definition is in the law, so it's not really.
Yeah, but you could buy 40% of 10 projects and achieve it that. Yeah. If they were separate parcels, but it's an issue that we can't really get around, but that's they're
you can't apply for a utility scale single user project, correct?
This is distributed generation.
Yeah, this is the 2 megawatt limit on this program.
And then the other procurement coming up after DG, because they do one utility scale, 6 megawatts.
Yeah, so
For a single utility.
I think we should probably, why don't you get back to us offline on that, because it's outside the adjustable block program.
Thank you. There's also nothing that precludes them from building additional solar, it just wouldn't be in the auspices.
Well, and the other thought was, could they do it like do 1 2 megawatt system this time around, and then next fall, another 2 megawatt?
So they could not do that. The question is, could you do multiple bids to get around the 2 megawatts? And so there's specifically addressed in the guidebook that, the limit is 2 megawatts on a site no matter when you built it. So just to specify that. We'll do one from the phone and then I'll come back to you. Are bonds being accepted as collateral? That is part of the contract process. Sounds like 5% collateral is going to be required at the time of contract signing rather than withheld from the last payment as described in the plan. Can you confirm if this is a done deal or still pursuant to the utility contract? And the plan is, I guess I will say that it's a done deal. And the plan does actually read that it's required. It just may not be abundantly clear on a first read of that particular sentence.
There's multiple sections of the plan that describe the collateral requirement, and there are some that specifically talk about it being due within 30 days of contract execution.
So
The reference to holdback is about ongoing collateral, and in retrospect, the wording of the plan may not have been as clear there as we had intended.
So as Anthony pointed out, there's multiple places in the plan that speak about collateral, all of which indicate that collateral would have to be presented at the time of contract signing. And the sentence that you may be referring to is the one that refers to ongoing collateral after the project is complete. Yep.
Scott, my question is actually on a similar topic. We can see reference to cash or credit as collateral rather than bond. So when you talk about bond, are you specifically referring to bond as an option?
So I was simply reading what someone typed here when I said bond, and so hopefully I never actually used the word bond as my own language. I believe that would be subject to the contract process as to whether a bid bond would be an acceptable form of collateral.
I think that is now, bond is not an acceptable form, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, that's definitely being discussed in the contract process, I can tell you. So when it comes out, it will either say it or it won't, and you can let us know why you think it should be included or shouldn't. So, yeah.
And then one additional question, so in a scenario where a developer bids 2 co-located projects together,
Community solar or DG?
community solar. One is selected, the other is not. But the one that is not selected might have a superior location in terms of distance to the intersection or comparability with existing land or making it farm or remaining land. So my question is, and I'm guessing the answer is, it has to be the location within 5 or whatever percentage of the location of the project one bid rather than the one that lost.
Yes. And again, maybe we'll hold that for the lottery discussion, but
You can't substitute co-located projects.
yeah.
We're not allowing.
If you don't want to build ultimately it comes out, if you don't want to build a project, you shouldn't submit.
Okay, thank you.
All right, the next question from online. In a situation where non-ministerial permitting is not required, can you clarify exactly what information needs to be provided at the time of Part 1 application? At time of Part 1 application, assuming that you're above 25 kilowatts and so you're required to provide us this information, if there is no non-ministerial permitting that is required, and again, I would refer you to the language of the lottery procedures because that's the same language that's in the, I guess that's the same language that's in the draft guidebook. There's a very specific set of instructions for what we need for that, and if there aren't any ministerial permits that are required, then you just wouldn't need to produce any of that information that's required there. So I'd refer you to that specific section for that. There won't be a requirement that you prove a negative when it comes to non-ministerial permitting, I guess, if that might be what your question is. The next question is, in the brochure, I see the text, quote, whoever owns the RECs has the legal right to say they used that solar power. Here's here's my question as it relates to a distributed energy behind the meter system as opposed to a head of the meter utility generated system. When a homeowner or business owner's solar power system reduces the amount of electricity the customer has to purchase from the utility company because the voltage is set higher to push solar power generated electricity ahead of the utility provided electricity. This is me reading from the question. Isn't the solar generator in fact being used by the homeowner? If not, what was used to enable to power their electrical appliances and lighting during the time? Wouldn't it be more appropriate to say the environmental benefit is monetized in the form of RECs is what is being sold to the utility, and that's being sold to others? So this was discussed extensively in the stakeholder process for the brochure, and so it's at this point the brochure is fixed, and we had extensive discussions around that, which we'll be happy to share with you offline.
Yeah, that there is intended to refer to the solar attribute associated with power. I think the phrasing may not be perfectly precise, but it's kind of a public-facing document. That's why it's intended.
Will there be a time prior to launch where we will have demo or sandbox access to the portal? It would be immensely helpful to have the opportunity to submit some demo projects in a practice environment. I agree with that. We will strive to provide that. There's a couple of concerns that we have. One is that by engaging in the stakeholder process, there's a limit to the point at which we'll be able to start coding the final product and doing our alpha and beta testing internally. And so there may be a very limited amount of time to do the sandbox testing. The other concern we have is that people not be confused that they're in a demo sandbox and think that they submitted applications and then come back to us later and say, how come my application didn't go in? I submitted it, and it was actually in the demo environment. So we need to solve both of those problems before we can do this, but I understand your request, and it's a good request. If a licensed installer company is installing a DG behind the meter system on its own property for its own benefit, to what extent must disclosure forms be executed by the installer for its own benefit? Does it matter whether the installer company is a corporation, LLC, or proprietor? So I think that goes back to the question we said that we would internally discuss that with us. I would say if you're going to make comments on that, let us know what the impact is. If you're an installer who does 1,000 systems a year and one of them is going to be on your home or your business, and it requires you to do a disclosure form on your own business, then it might just be the answer is, yeah, just do the disclosure form. It'll take you 10 minutes and that's it. Sorry. But if there's actually an issue where this would be something that you would repeatedly see and it would cause concern to you, let us know what that scenario would be so that we can take into account the cost versus the benefit. On page 23, the guidebook states community solar projects will not complete disclosure forms for obvious reasons. And then on the following page, it states that all projects must provide a signed disclosure form and proof that brochures have been provided. Can this be clarified? I guess I'll look at page 23. I didn't remember saying for obvious reasons, but
You got their editorial comment.
Oh. We'll make sure to clarify that. So there is a disclosure form that's required for community solar related to the community solar subscribers, and the community solar farm itself. That form, which was covered in the stakeholder meeting this morning, does not include as much detailed information on items that would not be pertinent to a subscriber versus items that would be pertinent to a homeowner or business who put solar on. So we will make sure, thanks for pointing that out, we'll make sure to make that clear in the guidebook. Regarding part 1 of the application, one of the requirements is to provide attestation of non-ministerial permits have been obtained. In the case of solar canopies or carports, AHJ approval is a lengthy process. In this case, would you also require construction permits? The general idea behind this is that we want to make sure that you have a viable project, but a lot of the risk is really inherent on you as an installer. If you do a part 1 application, you get a contract signed by ICC or approved by ICC and signed by the utility, and you post 5% collateral on the project, and the project is not built within 12 months or 18 months for community solar, you forfeit your 5% assurance. And so at some point, there are some things like if you think that a building permit might be unlikely and we're not requiring you to provide the building permit, the risk is really on the developer at that point being held by their 5% assurance. we are not going to require permits that are not normally required under the program. If a system is interconnected at the time of application, can we submit both Part 1 and 2, or can Part 2 only be completed after Part 1 is approved? That goes to a previous question, and we'll discuss that internally. If you have comments on that and how we could do that, let us know. That goes back to the question about whether you would have to post collateral if you have a system that's already completed, or whether you could take it out of the last payment or the last rec delivery. So we will discuss that internally, and feel free to put comments on that just to make sure we do. With respect to the 5% rule, we understand the desire to avoid gaming the system, but we also feel that as currently drafted, the rule is unreasonable. We support the applicability to AC capacity. We recommend the removal of its application to more than 5% change in plot placement. So again, we'll take that as a comment. Please submit that in writing, and if you have any more justification you can put behind the plot placement, knowing what our issues are, then please provide that as well. Can a PPA be reassigned after an application is submitted? E.g., the PPA is signed with a building owner, and then they sell the building, so the PPA needs to be assigned. Is that okay? It is okay. There's a couple of scenarios there, though. So if you sign a PPA at the Part 1 time frame, you do a disclosure, that customer signs the disclosure, the building is sold, you complete Part 2 and there's a different building owner, we would need you to redo the disclosure to the new building owner, and they would need to sign that. At the point that your Part 2 is complete and you have a contract with the utility, and that PPA gets reassigned at some point internally during that time, that would be subject to the contract process, but I don't see a reason why that would be of any. We might take that to the contract team to see if that would be of any concern to them. Like, I don't know, off the top of my head, not thinking of anything that would be a deal. But for us, what we care about and what we control as the addressable block program administrator is what I just stated, that you would have to redo the disclosure if there was a different person who was the ultimate owner. Page 24, describe the expected mix of residential and non-residential subscribers. That comes directly from the plan, and so that's why that's there. What we're actually trying to get at is your mix of small subscribers and not small subscribers, because that's what's in the adders. So I believe that's what we'll try and clarify in the actual wording on that.
Yeah, there was, I think, within the plan mitigation process, I think there was specific emphasis on trying to understand whether we would have residential subscribers, if I remember correctly, not just small subscribers. So there may be the aspect of it, the dimension of it, that also there's kind of a public policy consideration on ensuring that there are actual residential subscribers, not really subscribers of a certain size, even if the adders and other minimum requirements are for small subscribers, not for the residential.
So Anthony pointed out that for program management reasons and public policy reasons, we may want to know that information, and so we may still ask for whether residential versus non-residential as a public policy matter. Keeping in mind that some of the data that we're collecting here is because we are going to redo the plan, revisit the plan, sorry, in 2019. And so some of this information might be useful for us as we, with you as stakeholders, review the plan in 2019. This may have been covered already, but for large-scale systems, a 3-megawatt project, for example, can be submitted to the program, and the project's incentive will be capped at 2 megawatts, correct? Or actual project system size is capped at 2 megawatts. So what's outside of the program, as Anthony succinctly stated, is of no concern to us. A caveat to that is that if you're a DG project, you have to sign a irrevocable transfer agreement in GATS or MRETs for 100% of the capacity of your system. So what that means is if you plan on doing a 3-megawatt system, you need to...
Actually, the definition of both DG and community solar have a 2-megawatt.
So the caveat, I'll get to the community solar because of the QF. You could do 90, you could do a lower.
I'm saying a 3-megawatt project would not even be eligible for our 3-megawatt AC would not even be eligible for this program. So I don't think there's even.
Well, I think so. If you build 3 megawatts of capacity on a site and you separately meter one of those megawatts and it's not part of the program, then it's a no. Separately metered, separate identification number in GATS or MRETs. Then the fact that it's there doesn't really impact any of your other applications for us.
That would also be subject to the utilities interconnection approval because they have.
You would need to have a separate interconnection, yeah. thanks for pointing that out. So that extra 1 megawatt would need to be interconnected separately, metered separately, separate non-number or MRETS ID number. So it would have to be completely separate, so that you could give us 100% of the RECs out of the 2 megawatt system, and so that we could disregard the additional megawatt. In regards to Part 2 requirements, a photo of the meter is required. Can you clarify what meter specifically needs to be pictured? As possible, utilities will require their own additional REC-specific production meter to participate in the program, like the recent Mass Smart program. The meter that we're requiring is the meter that is being used to report REC production to MRETS or GATS. Any other meter that may or may not be required under from the utilities is not what we're trying to get here. We are definitely not trying to get your net meter. And there's a very detailed section on metering with tolerances and whether they can be reconditioned and sizes and all kinds of stuff in the guidebook.
And we allow converters for small systems. So in that case, it would be a picture of the inverter.
Picture of the inverter readout or the electronic output. Back to Ryder, and then just to clarify, I'll go back, sorry, to one question. So just to clarify, community solar projects, if they're subscribed at less than 100%, can do a irrevocable transfer agreement for the percent of their subscription. So if you're subscribed at 95% and you're selling 5% of your output as a qualified facility, then the irrevocable transfer agreement would be for 95% of your output. Just to correct my caveat in the 100% irrevocable transfer. Back to Ryder POGCS. Does NM1 to NM6 play into this mix description?
I haven't looked at that, right? That's ComEd, community solar, Ryder. Top of our head. We'd have to come back to that.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that. Regarding 20% developer cap, will a single system that partially pushes a developer award over 20% be rounded up to the total system size? For example, if 20% is 8.8 megawatts and the developer has 5 2-megawatt projects awarded, will they retain the 10 megawatts total or be forced to forego the 5th system or have to resize? So a lottery question, we'll hold that to the lottery. What's the build-out time for DG behind-the-meter projects? You have 12 months to complete your project from the time of contract signing. Do you have an approximate time frame for release of the new greater than 25 kilowatt disclosure form? As soon as possible, and we think that will be very soon, but I don't want to put an actual date on that because the final version was just approved. So, are there any prevailing wage or compensation requirements of installation personnel involved in installation in order for a project to be approvable for the RECs under the adjustable block program? No. There may be requirements in your jurisdiction, but they're not requirements per se of the program. Could the system administrator provide their definition and example of non-ministerial permits? We can. It's the definition that we provided in the guidebook. So we could talk for a week about non-ministerial permits and not be done talking about non-ministerial permits. And so we, again, put a very detailed, we put a very detailed description in the, as Samir pointed out, it's both in the lottery requirements and in the draft guidebook, and that's the kind of the final say on ministerial versus non-ministerial permits. I would again go back to the idea that at some point the developer is simply taking risks if they haven't obtained a non-ministerial permit, that they'll forfeit their collateral that they've deposited, and that becomes a major incentive for a developer not to put in a non-viable project.
And I think your last comment is essentially saying, I think reasonably, the risk is on the developer. I would also say that the guidance provided is less than clear, in part because the requirement is that it's upon the commercially reasonable investigation of the developer that are required for submission at the time of application to the adjustable block program or something like that. The commercially reasonable investigation of the developer, especially given what, the dynamics of the program have been over the last 6 months, obviously has a lot to do with, what permits seem. So I would just suggest that
Yeah, so the question for those online is that it's difficult for a developer, given that the definition of a required non-ministerial permit is what the developer in their commercially reasonable investigation determined was needed. That definition is less than clear, and so I believe your concern, correct me if you're wrong, is that you'll say that we've got all of our permits, and we'll come back and say, no, you had the blue-snouted salamander there, and you didn't get an environmental impact permit for that, so no, you can't do your project. Because the non-ministerial permit definition is not something that can ever really be clearly defined, I can tell you that we're not going to do that. If there's something that's glaringly obvious that there was a permit, we know that there's zoning variances in this particular county, and for every project, and this project comes across that doesn't have one, we're going to ask you why you don't have one. But to the extent that we're going to be digging down into various obscure non-ministerial permits and saying, oh, you don't have that thing and you should have had it, we are absolutely not going to do that. We've determined that's unworkable. That's the reason why we've shifted the whole focus to that. So I can offer you, our assurances that we aren't going to do that. But I guess without trying to define something that's undefinable, it's a difficult situation. So I mean,
Understood the challenge here, but I would posit that to me sounds like the right allocation of risk in the program. So thank you.
If you or anyone else has a great definition of ministerial permits that is bulletproof, then let us know.
It's not that, but when you add in the qualifiers in the definition, it changes the.
Yeah.
The commercially reasonable language was language that if someone proposed on objections to the long-term plan, we support that, the commission adopted it. So that's phrasing. I mean, this is one of those things that's sort of now set. In hindsight, could there have been more specificity there? Maybe, maybe not. Same thing, I think, with some of the content of non-ministerial. That was something that was proposed to us based upon standards in Massachusetts. It seemed reasonable. We adopted it. That's now what we have. But I think the example Kevin uses, yes, if we get a number of applications in a county and one developer doesn't submit a zoning variance, everyone else does. I think that's a really good example of the sort of thing where we are going to dig deeper. Right?
Yeah.
And we understand the counties with no zoning, so if that's the case, then that's the case.
Right. And I think as we've been putting through, reading stakeholder feedback on the lottery guidelines and thinking through what this looks like as a whole, it's difficult to read these individual requirements in isolation. So when we make a change in one place, it may change our attitude and approach when it comes to non-ministerial permitting. So there's other adjustments that we made to the lottery guidelines that help ensure the seriousness of projects, and suddenly you don't have to be quite as strict when it comes to requiring permits as you might have had to be otherwise if you weren't, you can create this counterbalance on the other hand. So it's been informing our thinking, and I think it's just all of these things are intended to kind of create a whole picture, and the individual elements maybe are being viewed by us not necessarily in isolation.
So just to clarify for those on the phone, Anthony and Brian's comments are that it's been an evolving process. The language that's in the plan is in the plan. We can't change that, so that's what we have. And as we've gone through various iterations of the lottery process, that's informed how we view non-ministerial permits. And if you have any questions specific to that, let us know. There's one question online that's related to that. I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll take a quick break. The question is, if the applicant believes the non-ministerial permits are not needed, do they need to upload a statement saying that's not applicable to the site? I think that's what they meant to say, but that's not exactly what they said. Yeah. So we are not going to require you to prove a negative, and so you just have to upload the non-ministerial permits that you believe are needed. If there are none that you believe are needed, then you will just leave that section blank and move on to the next section. Okay, we are going to take a 5-minute break here. Actually, 5-minute break, 7 minutes actually. So 3:05, we'll come back and resume the last bit. All right, for those on the phone, we're going to get started again here. All right, smart inverter. So I'm going to skip this next question for just a second until the IPA folks get here to make sure I don't miss answer. The next question is a lottery question, so we'll cover that when we get to the lottery. What is the proof the brochure was provided to the customer and the required uploads? Do you have a format on the site control letter? Would a signed lease or PPA be enough? So we're working on the proof the brochure was uploaded piece. On the required format for the site control letter is yes, a signed lease or PPA would be enough to show that you had site control. The question I skipped earlier was, maybe I missed it, but is there still a smart inverter adder? There's no adder in our program, in the adjustable block program, for having a smart inverter. There's a smart inverter tariff program. Is it a tariff, Samir?
Tariff.
The smart inverter tariff with the utilities. And so that's up to you to work out with the utilities how that works. But the smart inverter, the presence of the smart inverter tariff informed the incentive levels in the adjustable block program back when the plan was being developed. At this point, it's not neither here nor there for the adjustable block.
I'd also mention, my understanding is that the rebate involved with the smart inverter goes directly to the customer. So our whole model of a percentage, et cetera, is irrelevant to the administration of the smart inverter rebate.
Also, at this time, the smart inverter rebate of $250 per kilowatt applies for non-residential and community solar installation. It does not apply to residential. The statute states that at a future time, under the first condition, it will apply to residential, but at this time.
So Samir, for those on the phone, Samir at IPA clarified that the current smart inverter rebate only does not apply to residential systems, although it may in the future. And then I'll also throw one other caveat for those of you who haven't thought about it. If you're counting on the smart inverter rebate and you're doing a large project, that I believe the smart inverter tariff is based on DC capacity, and of course this program is based on AC capacity. So you may want to look into that as well. But again, that's not our nothing to do with the administration of the program itself. So don't take what we say as gospel. Read the tariff. In the required uploads for part 2, it lists a photo of the inverter and a photo of the meter, if applicable. If there is a meter installed, do we need to provide the inverter or meter photos, or will just the meter photo suffice? So there's 2 uploads. You'll have to produce an upload for both of those, but if your picture shows both the meter, with us able to read the meter reading and the entire inverter, then you could just upload the same picture twice, or you could just hit the little button on the camera twice to take the 2 pictures, one of the meter itself so we can read it and one zoomed out of the inverter, then that would be nice as well. Is there a capacity offset maximum? For example, can an eligible project offset 120% of current usage? The requirement for the program is that, try and find the exact wording of that.
While you do that, I'll mention the utilities, I believe, each have their own standards related to DG and offsetting load. Now, can I put you on the spot, Chip? Do you recall what ComEg's current policy is?
For the normal DG, you decide to go 110%.
Right. So ComEg currently is allowing sizing systems up to 110% of load based on annual kilowatt hour?
Not load, it's annual kilowatt hour.
Yeah, so annual kilowatt hour.
Yeah, and I can't find the language immediately, but it essentially the definition is on the customer side of the load, primarily to offset the customer's load on the customer side of the meter is essentially what that wording says. We received an offline question about that. It's probably something worth considering is if there's a, does that necessarily mean net metered? Or could a qualified facility that the meter is used, most of the load is used on site, but some of it's sold as a qualified facility, and it's not a community solar facility, but it is located on the customer side of the meter. Would that qualify or not? Something to think about. If anybody has any ideas on that, let us know. Because the way it's worded, it does not use the words net metered. All right, that's it for the questions online for this topic. Renewable energy credit management. So the requirement is that the system be enrolled in either PJM GATS or MRETS, that meter readings be entered at least annually to produce the RECs, and that the system have an irrevocable transfer for 100% of the system capacity, unless it's a community solar facility, which is only receiving payments for something less than 100%, at which point your irrevocable transfer can be matched to the percentage for which you're receiving payments. For example, if you're 95% subscribed, then you could keep the other 5% of your RECs. Is there any questions or comments or issues with the registries or how that whole piece of the puzzle is going to work? The registries are independent entities from us. They're independent from the IPA and from us at Incline, and they're not regulated by the IPA, but we work closely with them, and they're very receptive to ideas. And so if there's something that you're running into an issue with the setup of the registry that's being caused by the way our program is designed, then please share those with us, and then we can talk to the management at the registries about a long-term mitigation plan to make the registries work. So this is a unique program amongst what the registries work with. We've had extensive conversations with them already, but undoubtedly there's going to be something in this program that doesn't jive with what they're set up to do. So alert us to that if we're not already aware of it.
I think I would add to that in the past, they have made changes to the processes in response to needs of the IPA for some of our previous renewables and zero emissions credit things. That being said, especially GATS is a fairly large, it's part of PJM, they're part of a fairly large organization. They have software development cycles. They can't necessarily change something tomorrow. But
yeah, that won't be it won't be fixed quickly, but it will be fixed eventually.
Yeah. In our experience, where issues have come up that need changes, they've been able to accommodate them. But again, there's a time lag involved.
So one online question actually goes back to the last topic regarding site control, which said a PPA or lease would suffice. Would a letter from the client also be sufficient? So if the client is the host, the owner of the land, and yes, a letter from them showing that you have I don't have the exact wording in the from the guidebook, but it says something to the effect of that there is a lease or a option to place that on, then a letter from the person who issued that option or lease would be sufficient. All right, no questions on this. The one thing, approved vendors, we've had a lot of questions from approved vendors saying, does the name of your registry account need to match the approved vendor, or can you have one registry account for 12 approved vendors, single project approved vendors? And the answer to that is that you need a separate registry account for each approved vendor, because the approved vendor is the counterparty to the contract, and that it has to have its own rec account for that. Annual reports. There's a couple of different annual reports that need to be done. One on the DG side is a report of the systems that you have energized, the systems that are under contract, the number of RECs that you've produced over the year under those contracts, and then any other issues that have arisen. So there's a whole list of annual report items. The one thing I want to tell you about the annual report that is alluded to in the guidebook, but most of the information that's in there we actually can obtain from other sources. So for example, the number of RECs that you produced, we'll just obtain that directly from the registry, and we'll have that information. You can also obtain that from the registry as a CSV file, and so we'll endeavor to make it easy as possible for you to do that report. So for example, there's a My Generation report in GATS that you can download a CSV, and it'll show all your generation by month for all your facilities. We will make it so that you can click on that, download that CSV file, upload it into our portal, and that will be that section of the annual report. So you aren't going to have to manually go in and enter the readings for every single generator for every single month for the last year for your annual report. You'll just be able to upload that file, and our system will parse through it and fill out your annual report for you. You just make sure that it did the parsing correctly and then hit submit, and you'll be good to go. So to the extent that we can do that, we will. You still need to verify that that information is correct and hit submit on it. So a couple things I want to just be clear here, that we do have access to other aspects of the information, and the whole point of the annual report is to check 2 data sources and make sure that they match. So we will be doing that, and if they don't match, then we'll be asking you why not, and we'll be trying to make it as easy as possible for you to do the annual report. The community solar annual report is about subscribers. There's a requirement for community solar that you maintain a certain number of small subscribers if you have a small subscriber adder. If you competed in the lottery on the basis of having more than 50% small subscribers, then you would need to maintain that for the lifetime of the project. And there's also a percentage subscription for the project upon which you are being paid. So if you were being paid for your project being 95% subscribed, you would have to maintain 95% subscription through the life of the project. The annual report intention on our part, in order to collect that data, is that we would have you list your subscribers, the date that they started, the date that they finished, or if they're still a subscriber, the size of their subscription, and if they meet the requirements as a small subscriber or not. You will list all those subscribers by project with all of those dates, and the portal will calculate what your pro rata percentage subscription was for the year, your percentage of small subscribers were for the year. So you won't be able to have no subscribers until the day before the annual report, sign up, 95% small subscribers, and then have them all drop off the day after the report. You will have had to pro rata over the year meet that requirement for your subscribers. The actual mechanics of how drawdowns will happen on community solar and DG are part of the contract process, so I won't go into that. But it is informed by the annual report. If you look at the wording of the plan, the annual reports are used for the IPA and program administrator to inform them on recommendations for collateral drawdowns to the utilities. Is there anything on annual reports that anybody has any questions or comments on? Online question about GATS. Do you need to be registered? Should we get registered each system with GATS before January 15th? You can't register a system in GATS until it's complete. So if you're doing a Part 1 application for a project that has not yet been completed, there's no requirement to do anything in GATS or MRETS. That requirement is really that you show that the system's registered in GATS and you have an irrevocable transfer agreement as part of your Part 2 application, which is when the project is completed. You do need to have a GATS account in order to be an approved vendor, and so anybody who's been going through that process knows that you have to provide as proof that you have a GATS or MRETS account, but not that there's any systems. Can you please confirm that the collateral can be either paid in cash via LOC or withheld from the REC contract? I think this question may have been asked earlier, but not clearly answered. So I want to be crystal clear that at the point of contract signing, within 30 days of the contract signing, the collateral needs to be posted. It cannot be, that section of your collateral cannot be withheld from the REC contract. At the point that your project is completed, at that point you could exchange that previously provided collateral with the REC, withholding, as is mentioned in the plan. The plan also is very clear in that if you do not complete your project and there's no force majeure or other circumstances which would allow you to not complete your project, that collateral would be forfeited to the utility.
I would add one caveat there that came up, which was the question of projects that are completed and if there's any way to expedite them if Part 2 is completed. So I think that's something we're going to take a second look at that.
So Anthony pointed out that if you already have a project that's done, we're taking a second look at whether you'd have to post collateral then, or whether we can do something to make sure that, or to allow you to take the collateral out of the REC payment since the project is already complete. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Kevin Gordon there. So related to collateral, on the back you talked about it earlier. You said earlier that the contract, you'd be releasing a contract and it would specify whether it's letter of and you said that there's some ambiguity. I've checked through the IPA plans. There's no mention of bonds. There's several mentions of cash or letter of credit. So can you clarify your earlier statements whether we're going to see a contract that does include bonding?
I don't know. I don't know what that's going to come out. I know that it's been discussed, and I don't know but you'll have a chance to make stakeholder comments on that as part of the contract process.
I think the word bond was introduced in one of the questions. I think if it was up to us, we would not have used that word.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to clarify because you said, well, we haven't determined if we'll include a bond yet.
So because the contract hasn't been determined, I mean, it hasn't been determined.
So
but,
is there going to be another comment process?
There'll be a comment process on the draft.
On the actual contract?
Right,
yeah.
so we're not releasing a final contract. We're releasing a draft contract for comment.
So I have a new series of questions. When?
So just to catch everybody up, so the question was clarifying over whether a bond would be allowed or not, and the answer was that's part of the contract stakeholder process. And Kevin's question then was, when are we going to have the contract stakeholder process? I don't know if you want to release a date or.
You mentioned it on one of the earlier slides. We hope it will be December
7th.
Is the goal, but.
Yeah, that's for the release of the draft contract, and we say comments in draft contract process, and then we revise the contract based on those comments, and then release the final contract. What that looks like is a lot more like what we've done for competitive procurements or retail projects and the like, where our procurement administrator actually has more of the authorship hand in development of the contract, and the comment process looks a little bit more like the comment process that we use into that process.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. I just want to make sure that because that's something that should be clarified in one place or another, I guess, right? I mean, if the guy.
It's always been part of the contracts for the other things that we've done for competitive procurement processes. There's quite a credit requirement section in the contract involved.
Right, but I mean, I guess, can you understand my frustration in that, like, the plan never mentions bonds, right?
Well, it just came up in the comment, yeah. We're saying we haven't really finalized the contract yet, and that's what's manifest.
Okay, I understand. I just wanted to, I guess, point out the plan, the order, nothing else goes like use the word bond or the word bond doesn't appear in the plan or the order. So I just want to make sure that that's clear that it's cash or letter of credit as I can read.
Those are clear. Those are clearly yes.
We'll look out for the contract.
What will happen to a community solar system that has, for example, 90% subscription status at year 4 of energization, but by year 6 has fallen below 50%? What are the ramifications considering all payments have been made? So the ramifications of falling below 50% are clearly outlaid in the plan that would result in a collateral drawdown based on what had been produced so far. The falling below 90%, because 50% is a threshold for a community solar project to be a community solar project. So that's a hard number. That's irrespective of which community solar project you are. You have to be at 50% to be qualified and remain above 50%. Now, you could, at the end of the day, as a community solar project, end up at 51%, and that's what your payments are based on. You could be at 78%, and that's what your payments are based on. You could be at 100%, that's what your payments are based on. But whatever you end up at in that process, which is a somewhat involved process, which can last up to a year after energization, that's your obligation. What happens if you fall below that obligation level that you set at the end of that term that's in your contract is subject to the contract process. Sorry if I missed this. Do you need an interconnection agreement for part 1 of the application as part of permitting? Systems above, so it's separate from permitting. There's a separate requirement that you have an interconnection agreement for systems above 25 kilowatts. It is not required for systems below 25 kilowatts, and that is an independent requirement from any permitting requirements. For the collateral, any restrictions to the form of payment, I think we just answered that. If you didn't hear the answer, it was that that's part of the contract process, and you will have a chance to comment on that. Did I hear correctly? The draft of the REC contract will be published on December 7th. Mostly correctly, the IPA is endeavoring to publish the draft of the REC contract by December 7th. What happens if your DG on-site customer leaves, but we continue to deliver energy? Can we continue to deliver and be paid for RECs under the REC contract? The driver for being paid for RECs under the REC contract is the creation of RECs. So if you create RECs in GATS, then you have fulfilled the contract by creating those RECs. The actual ability for you to pump electrons into an empty building and not have a load there is up to you and the utility and the tariff that allows the net metering, and that's beyond what we can do. So at the end of the day, we look at whether in MRETs or GATS, you created the RECs, which requires that your meter spin the requisite amount, 1 megawatt hour for every REC, and that will create a REC, and that's how we will measure that. And so I won't answer the specifics of what kind of load you would have to put in that building such that you could continue to create RECs, but that would be a question for the utility. All right, any other questions? That's all we got from online.
Specifically, I think, what were people expecting, other than contract issues, what were people expecting to see in the guidebook that maybe wasn't there?
So for those online, Anthony's asking, is kind of the last bullet point, is there anything you were looking for in the guidebook, anything that you still want clarification on we haven't provided to you? And if so, this is kind of your last chance. If it's not the contract and we haven't given you clarification, then ask now or hold your peace until the plan revision in 2019.
Oh, yeah, written comments too.
Yeah, no, so and I say a little bit jokingly, so we're going to put out this guidebook, but as we, just to refresh your memory, because it's been so long since we started this stakeholder meeting, at the beginning we talked about revisions to the guidebook. So the guidebook's not necessarily set in stone, and in fact, I can 100% guarantee that things will change in the guidebook because we'll run into scenarios that we didn't anticipate until the scenario showed up. So just because we didn't talk about it here doesn't mean that you can't, even after the comment period closes, let us know about some odd scenario that nobody thought about until now. We'll figure out a solution to that. So.
Something that I think would be helpful would be clarification on small subscribers and what type of incentives that they qualify for. So these are subscribers to community solar subscriptions. And our particular instance is we own lots of single-family housing, and some of that isn't eligible or isn't a good candidate for behind-the-meter types of projects. So we'll be looking to find a community solar subscription for that residential housing. What's unclear to us is how the fact that we've got one entity that owns all of these residential accounts, how will necessarily, what kind of incentive or adder will our subscription allow that solar project to qualify for?
Yeah, I think that's so the question is if what exactly is a small subscriber, and what if you have a large entity that owns many homes or apartments, but individually metered residents live in each of those, and would those be considered small subscribers? And I think, so take a look at the section, because we tried to define this pretty clearly with rate classes. And for everybody, if you can take a look at our rate classes to make sure we captured what are the small commercial subscriber rate classes and the residential rate classes. So I guess the question is, if each of those was on a residential rate class, I don't believe there's a definition anywhere that a small subscriber is based on the owner of the building.
Yeah, I don't recall that.
Are you, is the electricity included as part of the rent, so the one company is the bill payer for each of those? Yeah, so send us a comment on that specific issue and then the other issues that we've talked about with that same kind of scenario, because that's not clearly delineated, so we need to come up with an answer to that. But specify that the key thing there is that the person paying the bill is the same company, is not the residential owner, or occupant, sorry, not owner. There's a question about interest accruals on collateral deposits will accrue to the approved vendor for the SREC ? Project owner will only be able to count this balance at non-interest value for portfolio kilowatt hour, I believe, performance. I don't see anything in the plan that addresses interest rates at all for I don't believe the amount of collateral.
I believe that's correct.
I would say double check when the contract process comes out, but there isn't an interest. The collateral does not earn interest, and so that makes the second part of the question moot, I believe.
There would be no interest for an LC.
Right. Yeah. Someone asked for specific application fields. That, I'll throw that right back at you. That's exactly what we're looking for from you. So we believe we put the specific application fields in the guidebook. If there's ones that we need to miss, or that we missed that we need to add, ones that you think are there that shouldn't be there, or ones that aren't clear, that we need to clarify more what exactly that application field means, then that's the kind of feedback we're looking at from you. Yep. That we're collecting the actual lease or the PPA, is that?
Just a one-pager signed by the host of the system, if the system owner and the system host are separate. That's more specific to these things.
So there's a requirement that you show that the host, there's an agreement between the host and the owner to put the system there. Site, there's a site control issue. Is it a different question than that?
Are you looking for like a form letter that you could just?
Is there a specific form letter that will be?
Oh.
Previously, or is it just as long as it?
Was it, did we require anything?
No, in a previous program, I think we had a sample host. In
Oh.
the SCV program, we had a sample host agreement you could use if you wanted. I don't remember if we had to use that or it was just one of the options. I seem to remember it was about 2 sentences long.
Yeah, it was really, I didn't know if that was same process or not.
Well, we hadn't talked about that yet, so that's an idea that we'll consider. So. The question was, is there a standard, just to clarify for those on the phone, the question is there a standard host notification letter that IPA would publish that everyone could use and that would meet the obligation? And the answer is that we hadn't thought about that before, so we'll take comments on that and consider it. When do we plan to release the allocation of discretionary capacity, and is the additional discretionary capacity to block 1 if that category is way oversubscribed? So we'll shortly move into lottery questions. I guess we can kind of answer that now since we're coming to the end. So that's a lottery question. The discretionary capacity is not added to block 1. The way that the lottery procedures work is that if the capacity is oversubscribed by more than 200%, the first 200% gets block 1 pricing. The next group after the first 200% gets block 3 pricing, and that if the discretionary capacity is allocated, that would be after block 3 was filled, and that would get block 4 pricing, which is 4% below the block 3 pricing.
There's some nuances that if the lottery procedures document works through some examples of this. But, and again, if you read that, it discusses the plan for how we're going to allocate discretionary capacity. One unknown we have at this point is what categories will there be a lottery for. That will impact how it gets allocated.
So Anthony's comments are that the discretionary capacity will be allocated once the 2-week period is up, once we can see which, if any, segments have a lottery, and that there's some nuances on how that discretionary capacity is allocated, with examples in the lottery document that we'd recommend that you read through. The guidebook, another question about the smart inverter program. Again, the answer to that is that it's not part of the, smart inverters aren't part of the IPA program. They're a separate tariff with the utility. Could the guidebook please improve its explanation for how the approved vendor will show and prove the 50% small subscriber requirement for the purpose of preference in the lottery? We understand we would just need to check the box and we'll prove it later. Is that correct? So yes, you in the application as a community solar project will check that you intend to be meet the 50% small subscriber requirement, and then there are penalties listed in the plan and in the contract. There will be the same listing if you win a slot in the lottery and then do not meet that 50% small subscriber requirement.
All right. If I can talk. I would add to that one of the things plan provides for is data sharing with the utilities about subscription level. So we'll be able to verify with them who your subscribers are and whether they meet that definition, because we'll know the size of the subscription.
And Anthony's comment is that the plan allows for data sharing with utilities. And so we will know if people claim small subscribers that they actually have small subscribers. And I'll add to that, that was my kind of veiled threat earlier, that the whole point of the annual reports is for us to take data from 2 different places, and if it doesn't match, figure out why it doesn't match. So if you're thinking about putting any data on that is is not 100% accurate, then that probably will not work out for you, because we are checking that. There will be discrepancies for sure. Every program we run, we do checks like this. Always there's discrepancies. Oftentimes they're just the case of fat finger errors or issues with sometimes the utility data not being correct. So we'll just check with you if there's discrepancies, but we are going to track down every discrepancy until we figure out what the right answer is for that, just to be aware of that. It's a big part of our job. So this question is whether the collateral deposits will be held in a non-interest bearing account by the approved vendor. So the approved vendor is not the person who is holding the collateral that's being held by the utility, and whether the utilities hold that in an interest bearing account or not is part of the contract process. Would submitting the memorandum of lease that is filed with the county be sufficient to show site control as opposed to showing the full lease? If there's concerns on the lease that you are providing proprietary information that you don't want to get leaked out, we need to just see that you have a lease. So we don't need to see what the amount of the lease is. So if you want to redact the amount of the lease, or you can show some other document, and I would have to see what a memorandum of lease that's filed with the county is to tell you yes or no on that. But if there's something that is a solid document that shows that you have a lease, then that's all we need to know. We don't need to know the details of your lease. In fact, we would rather not know the details of your lease. So if you want to just black ink that out before you send it to us, then that's fine. We do need to know, don't black out the address and everything else, but we just need to see there's a lease. For the shading study upload requirement, can you clarify what type of document you're looking for in that upload? That is something we would like comments on, because the shading study requirement in the plan was pretty vague. Shading studies in other programs that we run are pretty vague. They ask for a shading study and people provide their version of a shading study. If anywhere there exists a shading study standard that's very accurate, bold, and concise, then we would love to know what that is. The best example of a shading study that's very clear and unambiguous is what's used in the California Solar Initiative and many other municipalities, both in California and around the country, which is the shading criteria that we published that in the plan that says essentially if you have any shading, then you need to have detailed information, and you get a standard capacity factor if you don't have any shading. That's what that whole list of height versus distance away is basically saying. Is there an expected processing timeline, number of business days, when we can expect the notice on approved vendors after submission? So if you have submitted a approved vendor application in the last few days, if you've submitted an approved vendor application in the last 2 weeks and you haven't heard from us, then please send us an email. If you haven't heard from us at all, we're processing those approved vendor applications pretty quickly, and I think that processed ones even that have come in just in the last couple of days. So if it's been there's no backlog on approved vendor applications. We're processing those pretty rapidly. So if you have one you think you've submitted and we haven't gotten back to you, then please contact us and we'll let you know what's going on with that. At what point in the application and lottery process would a project be moved due to the developer having greater than 20% capacity of a given group or category? Would this occur prior to the lottery, within the application process, or after the lottery based on the order of developer's random ordinal number? Assignment. What will the rec contract be? When will the rec contract be published? Different question. So the first question is, when is the 20% cap applied? It's applied not at the application phase, but at the actual lottery phase. The lottery will be run. There's very detailed examples in the lottery guidelines as to how that ordinal number capping works with the cap. There's several different scenarios that could happen. You could be capped in the first run of the lottery, in which case your extra projects would move that were beyond the 20% cap would move to the next section of the lottery. You could then again be capped in that next section of the lottery, or you could not be capped in the next section of the lottery, and all those projects that got moved could all be accepted into block 3 in that case. So there's a number of different scenarios. You could not be capped in block 1 and be capped in block 3. So each block is different, but it interacts because the numbers are all chosen just the once or the twice in the case of the community solar with 50% on the second lottery. There was while we're thinking about this though, there was another question earlier on that was slightly related to this, and I just lost my train of thought. About the lottery capping. I'll come back to that in a second when I remember it. If you were the one that asked the other related question, ask again and I'll remember it. Otherwise, I'll go through the questions. When will the REC contract be published to draft and final? Again, the IPA is endeavoring to publish a draft by December 7th. The final product will be does not have a determined date. There's a number of parties that are involved in that process. We need stakeholder comment to come back from stakeholders. The utilities are party to that contract, and so the utilities, the investor-owned utilities, are all part of that stakeholder process as well, heavily involved in that. And so to give a date of the final contract is not something that IPA is able to do at this time. If we were using any other software other than PV watts to calculate kilowatts hours, so we inform IPA, if so, how should we do that? The application form will have an option for you to check that you would like to use another format, and then we'll work offline with you on that to get a copy of the license for that form that software that you're going to use, so we can use it to evaluate your project. So that will be on a case-by-case basis. We'll work directly with you on that. To be clear, the 20% cap applies to each individual block and category. The answer to that is yes. During 15 years of SREC contracts, say innovation in panels jumps materially and CS project owner decides to upgrade X% and this causes X% more electricity. Does this have a monetary gain via extra SREC final production? No, it does not. The contract the plan says that the contract will be for all the SRECs that the system provides. So if you contracted to provide 10 SRECs a year and you provide 25, then you just gave 15 extra SRECs to the utility. You will not be compensated for those 15 SRECs, but your system has to have a standing order for 100% of the production, and so all of those SRECs will go to the utility, and you cannot go up in your payment. So would it be 20% of block 1 and 2, or 20% of block 1 and 20% of block 2 should the lottery be triggered? The way the lottery is structured, it's 200% of block 1, which is the same thing as saying block 1 and block 2. And so if the lottery is triggered, it means by definition that block 1 and block 2 were both filled. And so the 20% would apply to the total capacity of block 1 and block 2, or 200% of block 1. Both those numbers are the same number.
And if there's no lottery, the developer cap is not relevant.
Right. And there's also another caveat in the developer cap that says that if you just had one developer and a couple of other random odd projects there, and if we applied the developer cap, it would then make the project unsubscribed, that we will apply we will let all the projects that were not from that developer into the block, and then let the rest of the block fill up with what that developer had. So we won't cut you off from as a developer and make a block undersubscribed with the 20% cap. So a bunch of little caveats there of different scenarios with that. If there's something we missed in that, let us know.
So I think you sort of related to the cap. Do you round up?
That was the question. Thank you. I don't think we actually addressed. We said that if you so in another part of the lottery, I would say, to be consistent with what we said, in another part of the lottery, we said that if your project was going to put the lottery over, then your project in its entirety is accepted. I would need to look at the specific language to see if the cap applies to that. I would think for consistency's sake that we would do the same thing, but we'll get back to you on that if it's not clear.
First impression.
Yeah, that'd be a good clarification. It doesn't say that for block. I think it actually only puts up for block 3, not block 1 and 2. Yeah, the intention was for that to be the case across because you could do split systems and it would be a disaster if we did that, and so because then we'd have to give you the option to not accept if it was smaller than the full size. So our intention was not to do any of that. So we'll revisit the language to make sure that's clear. Okay, got it. And so follow up with in terms of the sell cap, is there just curious what the specific justification that is in the IPA plan, order, statute, where is that specifically mentioned, where does that go?
So just for the people on the phone, the first question was, how we dealt with partial fills on the developer cap. If the developer hit the cap and they, with a 2 megawatt project, and they still had 1.9 megawatts left, would they get to round up and do the full project or not? So we'll get back if that's not clear in the plan on that. And then the second question was where the developer cap came from, and we'll hand that question right over to them.
I mean, I think we held a comment process in trying to figure out what guidelines would apply to lottery applications, and received robust sets of comments across 2 periods of comments, and then provided a fairly extensive document justifying our choices. So that's basically the record for making that determination. In terms of, legally, where do we get the authority to do that? It's no different than setting up requirements for the adjustable block program generally. We're tasked by statute with administering a program and creating program qualification requirements, project qualification requirements, and the developer cap just kind of fits under this umbrella.
General program requirements.
Yep.
Okay.
So Brian's answer in summary, which I can't really do it justice, was that it applies to the IPA has general authority to develop the program rules under the plan, and it applies under that. The next question is, the document says the cap applies to developer, installer, not approved vendor. Does that mean as long as the systems are being installed by different entities than affiliates, then not affiliates, then they can be under the same approved vendor entity? You just specify what installer you're using on the portal. So I want to, in general, the answer is yes, we're not doing this by approved vendor. So you could, if there was a developer, if there were 2 large developers that both wanted to use the same approved vendor, that would not preclude them from, they wouldn't run into each other's developer cap. They would each be treated separately. The caveat to that is that they and their affiliates are treated as one and the same. So if you have a company and you create 8 LLCs that are owned by the company, and together those systems win 30% of the projects, then they would together be capped. But if you have that same situation and then another developer, and together both those 2 developers, get 25%, but one of them got 15 and one of them got 10, neither of them would be capped if they were not affiliated to one another in any way. So it's based on the actual affiliates of the developers and not of the approved vendors. And that's a clarification from the original draft language. So I can understand why that question would come up, because that wasn't clear in the original draft. And another question to clarify, what is the entity used for the purpose of the developer cap? And so it is the developer and not the approved vendor. 5% net metering sunset clause. How does community solar factor in the equation? If included, the sunset is coming faster for non-community solar DG projects. I believe that the questioner is referring to a clause that states that net metering will be re-examined at the point that the amount of capacity that's net metered is 5%. There's a whole lot of details around what that 5% represents and how it's measured and whether it's peak capacity and all that. None of that is part of the adjustable block program. It's all in the, I'm not sure it's covered in the net metering tariffs or in the law.
There's a separate tariff.
A separate tariff that covers that. So that's subject to the utilities and the ICC. It's not part of the adjustable block program. We definitely are cognizant of the fact that a net metering cap may be reached, at which point the amount of compensation that someone is getting would be less. If you look at the plan that's mentioned in the plan, it was used in developing the incentive amounts. And should such a net metering cap be reached, and we're re-examining the plan in 2019, then certainly that would factor into what the incentive levels would be. But the actual net metering cap itself is not of something that IPA or the program administrator or the program itself controls.
Question on whether it's expected reps versus actual.
I think I got that. Yeah. Another question on if the installers are not affiliated, is it fine? I'm assuming that question was back with the 20% cap, and so we want to make sure that overall in this program, try and say this clearly, if you think that you're doing something that that is contrary to the intent of what we're trying to do, then that's not allowed. So if there might be some loophole in the way the rule is written and you're able to caveat your way around it and do something which clearly was not in the intention of the rule, then it's not allowed. So we get this in all of our programs. We get these leading questions that are kind of like, well, what about this? And what about this? Which comes to the idea that I'm trying to do something. So I just want to be very clear on that the developer cap cannot be circumvented by simply having separate installers do the installations while the same developer is the developer of the projects. So it's really the intent of that is pretty clearly written in the lottery guidance, and I would read through that. If there's any ambiguity there, our intention is that affiliated parties not have 20% of the lottery. So anything you could do to get around that would be an oversight on our part. And if you could alert us to that, that would be great, so that we can make sure it's clear in the procedures. Question is how the IPA will identify which entity is the developer or the installer. So we collect on the application the name of the host, the installer, the owner of the project. So we have all that information and the approved vendor. And there are specific questions about whether you're an affiliate of any other of those entities in the program. And so we will have that information. Also on the approved vendor applications, there's a pretty extensive section where approved vendors have to disclose all of their affiliated companies, and so we're aware of that information as well, to the extent that approved vendors are also developers or installers. All right, were there any other, and for those on the phone as well, were there any other lottery questions that I have not addressed? I know that most of them either came back up on the floor or were re-asked. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes. If you still have a lottery question, or maybe when you haven't asked yet, go ahead and hit us with those, and same in the room if you have any lottery questions. Happy to answer those. So the question is, can you clarify the difference between developer and approved vendor? And do you have the intent to limit the ultimate owners of projects? The difference between a developer and the approved vendor is pretty clear in that the definition of an approved vendor is very clearly laid out in the plan, and the approved vendor has to go through the approval process, be certified by us as an approved vendor. The approved vendor is the counterparty to the contract with the utilities. So what an approved vendor is very clearly delineated. Developer or installer is the entity which is actually building the project. The name that the entity that's doing that, I guess we don't have a clear definition. Maybe we should have a definition of exactly what the developer is. I guess we'll take that under advice. That loosely, yeah,
just allowing for the fact that there could be different models.
Yeah, I mean, so in the industry, it's somewhat synonymously sometimes used developer as installer, and installers being the same entity, although in many cases the actual company doing the installation is different than the project developer. So we'll definitely take a look at that and see if we need to do a better job of defining that. Is there a intention about whether projects can be sold and meet the 20% developer cap? I don't think we specifically talked about that. There's no way that we're tracking ownership of projects for the 15-year life of the contract, so I'm not sure that would be enforceable in any case. If IPA has any comments on that otherwise. Is it at all possible that the discretionary capacity will be identified prior to the 1/15/19 program start date? It will not be, per the lottery documents, it will not be determined until after the applications are in.
Yeah, the reason for that is because we simply won't know the interest in any given category until applications begin being issued. So it'd be speculative on our part to make an assessment of where discretionary capacity should go until we've opened the program and start receiving applications into the program.
So Brian's comment was that without knowing what the application volume will be, it would be premature and speculative on the part of the IPA to do allocations without seeing what the actual applications were. Question from the floor?
Yeah, Tim Bowles, Solar. On the issue of the allocation of discretionary capacity, all the discussions seem to be that the IPA won't make that decision until you determine which categories are deserving of or are oversubscribed and deserve that additional capacity. But in the actual lottery documents that were just published on Wednesday night, I think section F2, there's discussion that in addition to determining what blocks are oversubscribed, you also need to look at the budget that's available and, as it relates to the utility and the brownfield competitive procurements. Can you talk a little bit more on how that will impact the available discretionary capacity, or is that already
Unfortunately, the results of that procurement hasn't been released yet, so we can't discuss that procurement.
No, I understand that, but I guess to clarify, my question is more that it was our understanding that the 25% discretionary capacity was already allocated to the adjustment block program. It was just a matter of what categories were going to be allocated.
So there's a finite budget, so we have to take a look at the finite budget for the overall RPA.
So the question for those online is the lottery guidelines list that there's a potential budgetary constraint to the additional 25%. And the question is that the industry's perspective perhaps was that 25% was a done deal, and if it's not, what's the likelihood of it not being the full 25%? And the response was that the procurement, which will determine that, has not yet been completed, and so there isn't.
There's language in the law about prioritization of contracts that would govern.
So as where before in the preliminary draft of the long-term procurement plan, that capacity was evenly distributed across all three categories. Had that remained the case, this would not be an issue.
It potentially could have been still. I mean, we may have had
We wouldn't have had discretionary capacity, so that would not be an issue, just because there would be 33% allocation to each of the three categories in the law. There would be no discretionary capacity allocated. They would all be fixed in three equally sized blocks. So that wouldn't necessarily.
It would have impacted probably the opening of blocks.
Yeah.
It sort of nets out the same way.
Yeah, the kind of sequencing of events where we're looking at results from initial applications and determining what the size of additional blocks are would not have been a feature of the first phase of the adjustable block program in that scenario. But I mean, there could be, if there's something that's fairly slow to fill up, and there are contracts that by virtue of them being executed could potentially put you over the budget cap, and there's the need not to execute those contracts or delay those contracts, that could have been a possibility even with even with no discretionary capacity allocation, with just having three.
So for instance, in say the small DG category, where I think the expectation is that will be slower to fill, if the budget is exhausted before that block is filled, it may never be filled. That capacity may be filled back.
I don't think that's the expectation, but I mean, there's theoretical possibilities of not being able to complete various things described in the plan the budget. That's the one thing that's a bit immutable. There is the potential through the plan revision process, for instance, to think how the alternative compliance payments that are being held could be used to manage things on the margin, so that we have the ability to go slightly beyond the budget to meet certain requirements. But the Commission's order in 2018 at least said that those are to be used for long-term contracts. So we kind of have to take long-term contracts for utility scale facilities. We kind of have to take those things and sort of separate them out and see what the budget looks like with that allocation in place.
So for those online, a rather detailed discussion about the budget and how at the end of the day, everything's limited by the budget, regardless of how the last bits are allocated. Go ahead. Yep.
Clarification, the cap applies to developers. So there could be a scenario that an approved vendor is a counterparty and owner of 80% of the project awarded rent.
So just the question is there a scenario where an approved vendor could be the approved vendor for 80% of the recs? And you said approved vendor and owner, and I just want to clarify that they could be acting as the approved vendor for, yes, theoretically, one approved vendor could be the approved vendor for 100% of the recs if you have one third-party approved vendor that has a bunch of arm's length, agreements with companies to act as approved vendors for them.
All the developers choose to use aggregators rather than become approved vendors themselves. A model like that could happen. It's unlikely, but
Yeah.
not that unlikely.
If an owner-operator who is also a developer submitting projects later acquires additional projects from a different developer post-award, where the total megawatts under the final owner-operator's control be considered an aggregate towards a 20% developer cap. I think we already addressed that, but the intention was not that we be monitoring ownership levels for the duration of the contract, so unless we...
Cap is really around the lottery procedure.
Yeah, the cap
Not ongoing.
occurs at the lottery, not in an ongoing process. So short answer to your question is no, that they would not be capped. Yep.
John Person, trajectory. So quick clarification on the discretionary 25%. The original distribution between the groups for each category was 70-30, 30 group A, 70 group B. The way we read it, it looks like if, first you look at community solar, large GG, group A is more oversubscribed than group B, that same 70-30 split might not apply. Is that correct?
The question is that on original reading, it seemed as if there was originally a 70-30 split between Group A and Group B, or Group B and Group A actually. And if the discretionary capacity is awarded, could it end up in the end that the realized amount is different than that split, that 70-30 split? Is that? Well, yeah, will it be held, or could discretionary capacity be allocated so that at the end of the day, it ended up that it was 80-20?
I think that's only possible because, let's say, Group A, large CG goes to a lottery, but not Group B. So I think this is the circular problem we're in. Until we have applications in and see where we are, we don't have the information we need to make a determination.
Well, the 70-30 also extends from the fact that those are essentially utility RPS budgets, dependent on each utility. So at some point, utilities can only be counterparty to so many obligations because they only have so much funds to pay them. So the overall integrity of the process is going to require a 70-30 split basically between Group A and Group B, right?
Although we can allocate contracts to utilities that are not in their territories.
Right, that's where you'd end up going in order to be able to fix that. But
so Anthony's answer was in general that that could be possible, but it's premature without seeing what actually comes in to know what will happen. Another one from online. What is the intention of the 20% developer cap? If the intention is to ensure the Illinois installation jobs, then does it matter who developed the project as long as the installation jobs are located and diversified? Developers can be financing party, which isn't the installation job.
yeah, I mean,
That question to IPA.
Sure, we put out a document that tried to provide some rationale behind it, and that wasn't one of the things that we referenced. So I'd say I'd take a look at what's been referenced there as the rationale for the developer cap. That's been published alongside the lottery procedures.
Okay, so just to clarify for people in the room and on the phone, there were actually two documents published in relation to the lottery. Because it was a pretty involved process with two stakeholder comment rounds and a lot of discussion behind the scenes, we published a second document which explains the rationale behind the decisions that were made in the lottery procedure. So if you haven't read that, we would like to ask you to read through that, and the jobs issue was not one of the rationales for the developer cap that is discussed there. Yeah, Kevin.
So, two questions, the definition of developer that you raised earlier. So, I assume that you mean developer that holds interest in the project when the project enters into the lot, or so it was entered into the block, right? Because you could have, and I mean, we know this because we have kind of market story, we have transactions projects that happen. We've already talked about transactions projects that happen kind of after the lottery, right? I mean, there are transactions that happen before the lottery, right? And so if I assume would be developer, to be defined as developer on the day of the big project in the block.
So if you do it,
You can't be subject to it. If you buy a project from someone, and then it turns out that they go over another quote developer, right? They go over their cap. That means that your project is now over the cap too. You get it? Like
You own it.
you would own it by the time you apply in the program, right? But like That's what it means, to get to the definition of developer, it needs to be defined as on the day that you enter the program, the project in the lottery.
So is your question, just not for people on the phone, the question is around defining developer and who owns it. Is your question, just to clarify, what would happen if you put in an application on January 15th as the developer, and then you sold the project off on January 17th to another, to whoever the financer was who was going to end up owning it, or?
What if I bought a project on January 10th, and I entered that project in on January 15th, right? And then, you know, the lottery goes forward, and at the end of the lottery process, the entity that I bought it from, the developer that I bought it from, they're over there. Does that mean that my project now that I own, I entered into the system, is now over the cap with that other developer?
If they didn't, yeah, if they didn't own it at the time, you know, if they didn't, you're saying they didn't enter it into the lottery, right?
No, so they were at one point the developer of the project and sold it before the lottery.
Yeah, so I think the answer is pretty clear there. If you're the owner on the before the lottery, then that's who owns it. I think the more troubling question is what happens if you sell it after you enter the application, but before the lottery is run. If you want to really get into splitting hairs, that would be a question that's a little more nebulous. But I believe if as long as there's no two entries of the same project into the lottery, if you're the person who entered it and you're the developer of the project at the time you entered it, then that would be you would be the cap. There would be no way we would even know that it had been owned by the previous owner to apply that cap.
Sure. I guess it would be helpful to have some clarity around that. And you know, to the extent that if you're willing to take comment on the definition of developer, I mean, I think a lot of it goes to the answers that have been asked today. Yeah. To benefit from that one question specifically. So again, if you're interested in doing that, I think
yeah, I think it's just a matter of what form that takes when if we were to publish it, whether it's changing the procedures themselves, whether it's an FAQ update, whether it's in the guidebook, but there's things that are going to be, we're going to get questions that we're going to provide answers to as things move forward, even if the document itself is fixed or if the broader structure is fixed, right?
Yeah, can we ask people to just include those comments in this comment period?
Yeah,
just to make
that'd probably be helpful.
Yeah. So if you have comments on that particular one, maybe we can figure out a way internally to say that was a guidebook update, and you can go ahead and provide those comments now.
Speaking of comments, so we're still talking about 3 more rounds of comments or 2, right? And you get market guidelines, you got the guidebook, and then you're going to have the contract as well, right? So is there any way that the FDA can space those out a bit? Right? You got 2 that are going to be due on the 10th, and then you haven't announced the date. Is it possible to have them staggered so that you'll have 2 due on Monday and 1 due on Thursday?
You can submit them early.
Yeah. Just for you, the guidebook guidelines are due on the 7th, and yeah. So that's a good question. We are doing our level best to launch this program on January 15th, and so the amount of time that we ended up taking on, for example, the lottery procedure by going to a second round of comments on the comments for the lottery procedure ended up pushing us to the point where we were in a admittedly suboptimal position for people providing comments, but we have to code in all the stuff that is needed for January 15th, and to have that done, we need to have the comments in, and because just the amount of time, just so you know, those of you who are submitting comments, we see all the comments we receive, you know, dozens of comments, many of which go into several pages and which are very thoughtful and detailed, which, if you can imagine on our end, each of those detailed and thoughtful comments requires a couple of hours of us discussing those comments and then discussing them in concert with the other detailed and thoughtful comments which say something that is in contrast to that. So that whole time period means that we're operating in a way that's suboptimal. I'll admit that right now, to being able to submit those in time, but there's just in order to get it done, and that's the position we're in.
The other piece there is the holidays too. Ideally, we don't want documents that have comment deadlines over the holiday period if we can avoid that. So by virtue of, if we can get the contract out, for instance, by December 7th, then maybe you have a 2-week period for commenting on the contract, and then it's due December 21st. The contract doesn't come out until December 12th, or December 13th, or December 14th. You either shorten the comment period, or you put it out during a period where maybe people aren't able to comment on it. So we have to think about that as well. And then we want, the earlier that we have these things commented on, the earlier they're in place, and they can set expectations. I guarantee you, whatever bottlenecks you're feeling right now are being felt absolutely just as acutely by us. And to the extent you have a lot of work over a short period of time, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand your problem. Thank you.
It's only because of the amount of effort that goes into reviewing the comments that we're stacked up with comments. So, online questions. What was the intent of eliminating the reallocation of contracts between projects in the event that a lottery was triggered? That, again, I would direct you to the explanation document for the lottery procedures, which goes in depth as to why that decision was made. For projects that are not selected in the lottery, does the IPA have any plans to refund the application fee for the project? No, we do not. The application fee covers the review of the application, which has to be done before the project can be entered into the lottery. And so to refund that would leave that work uncompensated. Is the site control agreement adequate, different from an actual site lease with respect to the required documentation for community solar project to be eligible for the adjustable block program? The language for what's required for site control is pretty specific. I don't know the legal definition of a site control agreement, but anything that's short of a lease or binding lease or option is not adequate. And so if this does not rise to that legal level, then it would not be adequate. If you have a specific question on a specific format that you would like to use that you think is more rigorous or binding than a binding lease or option, then you can certainly provide that to us in confidence and we can review it for you. If an owner-operator who is also a developer submitting projects later acquires additional projects from a different developer post-award, would the total megawatts be considered towards the developer cap? Again, we don't plan on doing any checks on developer caps post-lottery. Got an in-person question? Go ahead.
For DG project, can you clarify on whether or not it's required in the application?
So for DG projects, there is a requirement that you show site control. And so if you plan to show site control through a PPA, then it would be required that you have a PPA. If you wanted to provide us a option, for example, a binding option, and then that would later turn into a PPA, then the option would be sufficient. We just need something binding that you have site control on that site. And site control is a pass-fail, so we just need to make sure that you have site control, and if you have it, you have it, and if you don't, then you're not eligible. So it's not evaluated any differently. The intention is just to make sure that people aren't putting in speculative projects that they just prospected on Google Earth, and that the actual person who's the owner maybe has no intention that, or no knowledge that someone has an intention to build a solar project there, or they have talked about it, but it's not a binding agreement. So the intention is that there be a binding agreement. One additional thing I can tell you, we spoke a little bit earlier about leases. Same thing with PPAs and system leases. Any documentation that we need to establish site control, you can feel free to redact the actual details of that agreement, and we just need to see what we need to know that you actually have it, which is the person's name and address, your name and address, signature saying that we agree to this. What the actual terms are, what your escalator rate is, we don't need to be able to see that. From the November 28 lottery procedure prevents the reallocation of REC contracts between projects at E1. That's fine, but then section E2 piles on with a 7-sentence paragraph of onerous restrictions, presumably intended to prevent any workarounds. Can we agree that the final sentence of section E2, which ties the REC to the interconnection agreement, is really the only compliance requirement that we needed to prevent such a workaround? So I think this falls into the category of relitigating the lottery procedure. There may be items that are in there, but at this point, I
think we don't necessarily agree.
Those are set. Providing the elimination of just a reminder to everyone that the lottery, we've now moved into the lottery section of the discussion, which is a question and answer about the procedures, it is not a request to change the procedures. Provided the elimination of the reallocation of awarded projects among the same developer submitted portfolio, does the administrator understand that the developer may be harmed when interconnection costs are revised by the utility post-award based on queued project now moving forward, and thus have the risk that an awarded project no longer being viable if a non-selected project ahead of it in queue was bearing a significant upgrade, which will then be passed on to the awarded project? Boy, are we ever aware of that. We spent hours and hours and hours and hours talking about this, so we are very aware of that issue. This whole lottery process and the multiple rounds of comments that we requested were all about our concern about trying to find a magic solution to this problem. So we definitely fully understand the problem. As far as we could tell ourselves and as far as comments that we got, there was no magic solution. This is the best solution that we came up with, and this is what we have. So.
And reallocation would not have solved the issue described.
Yeah.
We got in document.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have kind of a, one of the things we quoted in the second round of comments is, well, what if we had some sort of subsequent reallocation period based upon updated interconnection cost information? That was, no one really cared for that idea, and I think for good reason. So if you have a narrow reallocation window after the lottery selection process takes place, you don't necessarily have any better interconnection cost information at that point in time than you did beforehand. Maybe for the first queue position projects, they have a little more information than others, but by and large, there's still mystery as to what project interconnection costs are going to look like. So even if you know your cost of one project, you don't necessarily know how it relates to another project that may not be in first queue position and whether one will be cheaper than the other.
And to perfectly solve that.
So I'll just summarize with Anthony's comments. Perfectly solved, that would take hundreds of years. Go ahead.
Section 3.5 of the lottery procedures says that you're not proposing that the weight of the results from the lottery be applicable to future rounds. You mentioned what comes out of the 2019 plan. So it would be a correct interpretation then that I guess at some point the weights would be expanded, there would be a future opening.
So the question is, there's a comment in the lottery procedures that say that it's not necessarily binding on the post-2019 plan revision or plan review. And I think that's important, the language that's in there is that it's not necessarily binding on the 2019 plan review, meaning that the 2019 plan review might say that we like the queue that's there and we're going to continue to use the queue. That 2019 plan review is a stakeholder process that is reviewing the process. It's basically taking everything we've learned from having run the program so far and applying it to what we're going to do going forward. So
requires commission.
Yeah, I'd go one step further than that. It's not just a stakeholder process, it's a litigated process for another administrative agency. So if the ICC comes back and says that order is determinative, then there's nothing that we as the IPA can do about it. We're bound by that decision. If they say throw that out and start over for any one of a number of reasons, then it's rendered irrelevant. But I think that the main thing is that it's outside of the control of the agency. We can have a position that we take in litigation by virtue of the draft plan update that we receive comment on and what we file with the commission. But there'll be an administrative record before the State Public Utilities Commission that will inform how they decide the issue and ultimately whether this has any importance.
So it's not saying that 100% for sure the lottery gets thrown out. It's just saying that we can't tell you that for sure what will happen after the 2019 plan review.
Right. Decision of the commission ultimately in approving the update.
And we don't know what positions parties will take in that litigation. If someone really likes the order, they could come up with very strong arguments in favor of it, and maybe that's how these things settle out in the different camps. If someone isn't in such a good position or wants to develop different project types they think should be treated more favorable down the road, then maybe they bring up those arguments. And again, that's the ICC to determine when we revise our final file with them. And there'll be a record for them to make a decision on that through what's filed in that case. The 90-day case that would kick off in late September and then in December of 2019.
Next question online. For the signed interconnection agreement requirement for project applications above 25 kilowatts, who needs to have signed that interconnection agreement? The utility needs to have signed the
Not me.
interconnection agreement. Yeah.
And the applicant.
Well, the applicant, the utility wouldn't have signed it unless the applicant
Is there a nuance there that we're
signed.
missing?
Yeah, if there's something that we're missing in the question, in general, an interconnection agreement requires that an applicant apply to the utility for interconnection, at which point they would have signed their application. and that the utility approved that. So if anybody in the room has something that we're missing on that particular point or online, let us know. But that's our understanding of it, and so that would be the two signatures. Necessarily, the second signature wouldn't have come without the first, that the utility approved it. The one kind of nuance there is that if you're in a not in an investor-owned utility territory, the interconnection agreement may not have a standard interconnection agreement. And if you are in that situation, please contact us and let us know what your situation is. And there's kind of two routes there. If they have an equivalent of an interconnection agreement, we will work with you and the utility to make sure it is an equivalent, and that would be good. If they say we don't do interconnections of solar, then, or we're working on a process, but it won't be ready by January 15th, or any other number of things, that's outside of our control, because we can't compel a utility, a municipal or a cooperative utility to issue you an interconnection agreement. What happens to lottery winner 52 of 600 and is in the ComEd interconnection queue at 600 of 600 and has a time problem before it comes through the queue? Anyone who enters the lottery needs to be prepared to execute a contract and build the project. If your interconnection queues are by circuit, so it would be unlikely that you would be 600 of 600. But if you have a project that's number 10 on an interconnection queue and you are not certain that you could complete the project due to interconnection costs, then you're taking that risk by putting in the application. Obviously, as we discussed earlier, it's very difficult for you to know whether the first 9 projects will drop out, whether 1 or 2 of those projects will be completed, and where you'll end up in the interconnection queue. That's unknowable information, and that's the very lengthy and painful process we went through to try and eliminate that ambiguity, and came to the determination it could not be eliminated. So that risk is on the developer, and we did our best to try and mitigate and eliminate as much of that risk as we could.
One thing about that we did try to address is right now ComEd has an interconnection agreement waiver proceeding that's still open before the Illinois Commerce Commission. Proposed order's been issued, brief non-exceptions have been taken. The commission decision is likely by December 4th. If the commission decides that projects that do not offer project authorization, post non-refundable deposit, are kicked out of the queue altogether, we've kind of put some information in our lottery procedures. We wouldn't consider them to be non-applicants or ineligible because there's a queue management process that forces them out of the queue. That's one thing that we did do to account for the fact that they may have to make authorization decisions without visibility on whether their contracts are actually available.
And we understand that Ameren has similar but not identical process that they plan to institute to clear out the queue post-lottery.
So just to summarize for those on the phone, there's a proceeding currently in progress for ComEd, and Ameren has a similar process, which may result in projects that are waitlisted on the Adjustable Block Program lottery being kicked out of the interconnection queue, and we specifically addressed that in our guidelines for the lottery, that those projects would not lose their position in our queue by virtue of having lost their interconnection queue position because they were in our queue.
Their agreement terminated at that point.
I think it's kind of very early there. Can you talk more about the Ameren process? You know, when that's coming?
My understanding is that they've been granting extensions to the requirement for people to sign interconnection agreements, and at some point they will stop granting those extensions. I don't want to speak for them. They've chosen a slightly different route than ComEd. So
the question was around the difference between Ameren and ComEd when it comes to what happens to projects that don't proceed with a interconnection because they're on our wait list. And the answer is that you need to contact Ameren specifically to get the details on that. ComEd chose to open a proceeding, and Ameren chose not to. So. Will there be any exceptions which would allow substitution of RECs between projects receiving the incentives? For example, what if the utility determined the interconnection or network upgrade costs requirements determined to be higher after the REC is awarded to a particular project? No. The answer, short and pretty succinct answer to that is no, there is no exception which would allow substitution of RECs between incentives. There are, in the contract discussions there and in the plan, there are various situations where an interconnection, if an interconnection is determined as being not possible, I believe there's something that would allow that to, is that an accurate statement? There's mitigate, I guess that just gives you a delay.
Yeah, there's, for delay, there's, we allow.
There's some language around delay, but there's nothing that would allow you to either cancel, and certainly there's nothing that would allow you to swap. There's no swapping of any kind between projects. Does a 20% developer cap apply to all categories? The second document released the rationale developing this cap is around community solar given the number of projects in the queue. If so, would it only be applied to community solar? So the 20% developer cap applies by category, number one, and number two, whether this applies to outside of community solar, or is it just specific to
I think the guidance document specifically talks about community solar because, if my memory is correct, it provides an example of what this looks like, and community solar is probably the easiest way to give that example.
If you don't have the same sorts of ratios, then you're not going to end up with the same sorts of outcomes in terms of who ends up with contracts with developer cap in place potentially, because you may end up in a situation where you have, in order to fill out the blocks, you may be going back to the same developer in the situation that Kevin pointed out previously too.
If the site cannot get agreement signed in time, would an email from the utility suggesting the site pass their study and can move to construction enough? No, an interconnection agreement is required, and that's the only thing that can be provided. Can you repeat the answers in the room? Okay, if that was in regards to the last question, does the 20% developer cap apply to all categories? It's by category, and the whether it applies to just community solar, the example was to community solar, but if DG had the exact same situation, it would apply. But if DG had a situation where there was one developer and removing them would change a tier to being unsubscribed, then the rules allow for them to be re-added back in, even if that exceeded the 20% cap. Oops. Lost my mouse. All right, we will give a couple minutes. Anyone else in the room have anything? Anyone else online? All right, so to recap, talked about far too many things to recap. We'd like to get your comments on everything that we talked about today in writing. Please send that to us. So even though we discussed it today, we'd like to actually have your comments. Please make those comments as detailed as you can with justification for what you're proposing and an explanation of kind of an acknowledgement or not really an acknowledgement, just a solution that works around the issues that we've portrayed we're trying to solve. We appreciate definitely the input we've received today and the questions that we've received. As you saw, every time we do these stakeholder engagements, we run into questions that we had not even thought to ask yet, and we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't had the stakeholder engagement. So it's tremendously valuable for us running a program, and it makes the program of higher quality and run much more smoothly once it launches. So we realize that you put a lot of time and effort into providing us comments. We've put equal time and effort into reading and incorporating your comments, so please keep those coming. Comments do come to comments@illinoisabp.com. Deadline is December 10th at 5 p.m. And I think, Kevin, I think we made the deadline was 2 p.m. for the community solar, so they are staggered.
And one thing, I want to reiterate something that Kevin said earlier. We won't publish comments we posted. We won't post them until after the deadline. But if you can get comments in earlier, that gives us more reading time, and we appreciate it.
And if you put comments in tomorrow, and then you later want to change those comments right before the deadline, just let us know and we'll replace. It's actually every comment process we've had someone say, hey, can you replace our earlier comments with these comments because we thought of something else. That's no problem. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks.